Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I thought I knew these woods. For years, they'd been my escape, a place to clear my head after a long week. I'd explored every trail, every clearing, every hidden corner. But I'd never felt watched before. Not like this. Today, though, something was different. The air was thick, the birds had gone silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. It all started when I stumbled upon the footprints. They weren't mine. The tracks, pressed deep into the mud near a small stream, were like nothing I had ever seen before, massive, elongated, and spaced too far apart for a human stride. My first thought was a bear, but the shape was all wrong, no claws, just an oval print, almost like a barefoot human, but larger, much larger. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. I crouched down, running my fingers along the edges of the print, feeling the weight of whatever had made it. It couldn't be real, I told myself, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow even to my own ears. Must be a prank, some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew there were no kids around here, not this far off the beaten path. The stream gurgled beside me, oblivious to my unease, its waters winding through rocks and roots. I stood up, glancing around, and noticed something strange. More prints, leading away from the water, disappearing into a dense patch of forest. A little voice in my head told me to turn back, to forget I ever saw them. But my curiosity won out. I pulled out my phone, snapped a picture, and set off in the direction of the tracks, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the only sound breaking the silence. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more the uneasiness grew. The sunlight that filtered through the canopy seemed to dim, casting long shadows between the trees. The forest around me felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I checked my phone, realizing I'd lost the signal. Not that I'd planned on calling anyone, but still, it was like the world outside these trees had vanished. The prints led to a small clearing where the earth was softer, the ground here still damp from a recent rain. The footprints grew fresher, more defined, as if whatever I was following had passed through recently. I knelt again, examining the edges. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. My own tracks, the ones I'd left by the stream, were gone. The prints I had made just minutes before had vanished, smoothed over as if the forest had swallowed them. I straightened up quickly, glancing over my shoulder. Nothing but trees, a tangle of shadows and undergrowth. My pulse quickened, and a shiver ran down my spine despite the warmth of the afternoon. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just needed to get a grip. But as I turned back toward the path I'd taken, the air seemed to shift, growing colder, thicker, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, that makes you want to move fast, to get out. But I didn't. I kept walking. The prints led toward a rocky slope that climbed up into a thicker part of the forest, where the trees grew close together, branches interlocking like fingers. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to turn back. But then I saw it. A cave entrance partially hidden behind a cluster of pines. The tracks disappeared inside. I should have left right then. I knew it. But my legs carried me forward, curiosity gnawing at my better judgment. As I stepped closer, the temperature dropped even further, and the light seemed to bleed out of the world around me. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. The mouth of the cave yawned before me, a dark hole carved into the hillside. I peered inside, shining the light along the rough stone walls. The air was stale, a damp, earthy smell clinging to the back of my throat. The beam caught something glinting further back, scratches, deep and erratic, like something had been dragged along the rock. My chest tightened as I edged closer, the sound of my own breath too loud in the confined space. I froze. There, in the dim light, I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. I stepped back, swallowing hard, but then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that rolled through the cave, vibrating through my chest. My body reacted before my mind did. I spun on my heel, bolting out of the cave and back into the forest, branches whipping against my face as I ran. But the moment I broke into the open air, the growl stopped, and the silence fell over the woods like a thick blanket. I forced myself to slow down, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. When I turned back, the cave entrance loomed between the trees, dark and silent, as if nothing had changed. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. No growl, no footsteps, just the distant sound of the stream, oblivious to the terror that had seized my chest. I should have left then, turned back and forgotten about the whole thing, but something stopped me. Curiosity, stupidity, I don't know. I took a step back toward the cave, flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I saw it, something crouched in the shadows just inside the entrance, a shape too large to be human, with limbs that didn't bend quite right. It moved fast, too fast. One moment it was in the shadows, the next it was gone, melting into the darkness like it had never been there. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, the flashlight beam swinging wildly across the trees. I turned and ran, the adrenaline propelling me through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes. I could hear it now, something moving behind me, keeping pace, its footfalls heavy, uneven. The air grew colder with every step, my breath clouding in front of me, and that presence, that feeling of being watched, closed in around me like a noose. I burst through the tree line and into the clearing where I'd first found the tracks. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I couldn't stop, not with that thing right behind me. I glanced back over my shoulder, just for a second, and my heart nearly stopped. It was there, standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow, tall, hunched, its eyes gleaming in the dimming light. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, burning into me, hungry and patient, like it was savoring the chase. My hands fumbled for my phone, but the screen stayed black, no signal, no way to call for help. I turned back toward the direction of my car, praying I could make it. My feet pounded against the forest floor, but I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Every part of me screamed to look back, but I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the path that would take me home. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I stumbled to my car, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I chanced one last look into the trees. Nothing, just shadows and branches, twisting in the fading light. I tore out of there, tires skidding on the gravel road, not daring to slow down until I reached the main road. My heart didn't stop racing until I pulled into my driveway, the safety of my home, a flimsy barrier against the terror that still clung to my skin. I shut off the engine, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, finally reconnecting to the outside world. I grabbed it, glancing at the screen. The photo of the footprint stared back at me, frozen in time, a reminder of something that should not exist, something that was still out there, watching, waiting. That night, I locked every door, every window, double-checking each one before I went to bed, but sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those prints, heard that growl rumbling through the dark. I haven't gone back to those woods since. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees outside my window, I think I hear it, a low, distant growl, echoing through the darkness, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to follow the tracks. Story 2. I never thought I'd question my sanity as a forest ranger, but that night in Blackwood National Park changed everything. It started with a routine call, campers reporting strange noises, feeling watched, nothing unusual for the wilderness. But something in their voices made my skin prickle. I've been a ranger for 3 years now, and I know when people are truly scared. My name's Sarah Jensen, and I'm the newest member of the Blackwood Ranger team. At 28, I thought I'd seen it all during my training. Bears, mountain lions, even the occasional lost hiker thinking they'd stumbled upon Bigfoot, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered that October night. The sun was setting as I pulled up to the campground in my patrol truck. A chill hung in the air, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Fall comes early in these mountains, and the trees were already aflame with red and gold leaves. I spotted the campers immediately, a young couple huddled by their tent, looking jumpy. As I approached, the woman gripped her partner's arm tightly. "Evening, folks," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I'm Ranger Jensen. Heard you had some concerns?" The man nodded, his eyes darting to the tree line. "Yeah, we've been hearing some weird noises, and it feels like something's watching us. I've heard similar complaints before, usually from city folk unused to the sounds of nature, but these two seemed genuinely rattled. Can you describe the noises?" I asked, pulling out my notepad. The woman spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to explain, like a deep growl, but not quite a bear, and footsteps. Big ones." I jotted down their descriptions, trying to piece together what could be causing their fear. "Have you actually seen anything?" They exchanged a glance before the man replied. "No, not really. Just shadows, maybe, but it feels wrong, like whatever's out there isn't natural." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Well, let's take a look around. I'm sure there's a logical explanation." As I swept my flashlight across the campsite, I noticed large indentations in the soft ground near their tent, too big for a bear and the wrong shape for a mountain lion. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. There had to be a rational explanation. "I'm going to check the perimeter," I told them. "Why don't you folks head into your tent for now? I'll come back once I've had a look." They nodded gratefully, practically diving into their shelter. I couldn't blame them. As the last light faded from the sky, the forest took on an ominous air. Shadows deepened, and every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. I started my sweep, moving slowly and deliberately. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and underbrush. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease growing in my gut. About 50 yards from the campsite, I froze. There, in the beam of my light, was a clearly defined footprint, but it wasn't human or any animal I recognized. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of elongated toes. My heart raced as I knelt to examine it closer. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, hands shaking slightly. Just as I snapped the photo, a twig snapped loudly in the darkness beyond my light. I whirled around, my hand instinctively going to the pistol at my hip. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. "This is Ranger Jensen. Identify yourself." Silence answered me, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. Then, from somewhere in the shadows, came a low, rumbling growl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, too deep for a wolf, too guttural for a bear. It resonated in my chest, raising every hair on my body. I swept my flashlight in the direction of the sound, and for a split second I saw them. 2 eyes, reflecting the light like a cat's, but far larger and set much higher than any animal I knew. They blinked once, and then were gone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my training kicked in. I began to back away slowly, keeping my light trained on the spot where I'd seen the eyes. Another growl, closer this time, sent adrenaline surging through my veins. "This is Ranger Jensen," I said into my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got a situation at Campground B, possible large predator, species unknown, requesting immediate backup." Static crackled for a moment before a response came through. "Copy that, Jensen. What's your status?" Before I could reply, something massive moved in the underbrush to my left. I caught a glimpse of dark fur and a hulking shape that walked on two legs. It was far larger than a man, with a build that seemed to blend human and animal characteristics. "Holy," I breathed, forgetting for a moment that my radio was still live. "Jensen, do you copy? What's happening?" The creature let out another bone-shaking growl, and I realized with horror that it was circling me. I could hear heavy footsteps and the snap of branches as it moved, always just out of sight. "I need immediate evacuation for the campers," I said into the radio, my voice tight with fear. "There's something out here, something big." I began to edge back towards the campsite, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to catalogue what I was seeing and hearing. It didn't match any known animal species. The way it moved, the sounds it made. It was like something out of a nightmare. As I neared the edge of the campground, I heard the campers call out in panic, "Ranger, there's something out here!" I broke into a run, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. As I burst into the clearing, I saw the couple backing away from their tent, which was now in tatters. Massive claw marks had shredded the fabric, and their belongings were scattered across the ground. "Get in my truck, now!" I shouted, fumbling for my keys. They didn't need to be told twice. As they scrambled into the cab, I heard a roar from the tree line that made my blood run cold. It was filled with rage and hunger, like nothing I'd ever encountered. I jumped into the driver's seat, gunning the engine. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a massive, shadowy figure emerging from the trees. It stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, with arms that hung below its knees. Tires spun in the dirt as I floored it, the truck fishtailing before gaining traction. We sped down the access road, the vehicle bouncing violently over ruts and rocks. In the passenger seat, the woman sobbed quietly while her partner stared wide-eyed out the back window. "Do you see it?" I asked, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Is it following us?" He shook his head, his voice trembling. No, I don't think so. What was that thing?" I had no answer for him. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with what I knew about the natural world. Nothing made sense. As we neared the ranger station, I saw the flashing lights of backup units approaching. I pulled over, my whole body shaking with residual adrenaline. The next few hours were a blur of debriefings and reports. I described what I'd seen as best I could, but I could tell from the looks on my colleagues' faces that they didn't fully believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed myself. A search party was organized to sweep the area, but they found nothing conclusive. The footprint I'd photographed was dismissed as a possible hoax or misidentified bear track. Without solid evidence, my encounter was chalked up to an overactive imagination and the play of shadows in the forest. But I know what I saw. In the weeks that followed, I pored over books and websites, searching for anything that matched my experience. Bigfoot, Dogman, some unknown species. I had no answers, only questions that kept me up at night. I still work as a ranger at Blackwood, but now, when the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, I find myself watching the tree line, waiting, wondering if those eyes are out there, watching me back. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forest the same way again. There are things out there in the dark woods that defy explanation, and sometimes the line between legend and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. Story 3. The forest never sleeps. I used to think I understood that. A ranger for nearly 10 years, patrolling these woods through rain, snow, and scorching sun. But that night, with the air thick and the shadows pressing in close, the forest felt awake in a way I had never known. And what watched from the trees, hidden behind the black veil of the night, made me realize that maybe I was the one who should have stayed asleep, blissfully unaware of what stalked the darkness. The call came in around 10 p.m., the static crackling through my radio as I sat in the warmth of my patrol truck. The dispatcher's voice was barely audible, buried under a wall of interference. Reports of strange noises. Northern boundary. Possible injured animal. Can you check it out? Copy that, I responded, glancing at the map pinned to my dashboard. The northern boundary was the most isolated part of the park, where even the most adventurous hikers rarely ventured. But I'd driven through there hundreds of times. Every tree, every bend in the trail was familiar to me. As I drove out, the truck's headlights cut through the night, turning the towering pines into looming silhouettes. The moon was a sliver above, casting just enough light to turn the mist into a silvery blanket over the forest floor. The deeper I went, the more the woods closed in, the undergrowth swallowing the last hints of civilization behind me. I lowered the window, letting in the cool night air, listening for anything that might guide me, a wounded deer, maybe a bear. But all I heard was the soft crunch of gravel under the tires. Then a shadow moved between the trees. I slowed the truck, gripping the wheel tightly, squinting through the windshield. It could have been an elk or even a coyote, nothing I hadn't seen before. But there was something odd about the way it moved. Too upright, too steady. My heartbeat picked up a notch. I reached for the flashlight from the passenger seat, stepping out of the truck. The chill hit me the moment my boots touched the ground. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, that unmistakable scent of wilderness. But there was something else beneath it, a faint metallic tinge that clung to the back of my throat. Blood. I pointed the flashlight into the trees, its beam slicing through the darkness, revealing only more trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the beam, something tall, hunched, its shape lost in the shadows. I froze, every muscle tensing as the light bounced off matted fur, catching a glimpse of pale eyes that shone back at me. The creature shifted, slipping further into the darkness like smoke. I took a step back, heart hammering against my ribs. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin, swallowed up by the trees. No response. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear standing on its hind legs. But the way it moved, it didn't fit. It was too quick, too deliberate. I forced myself to move, sweeping the flashlight in a wide arc. The light caught on the underbrush, and I saw them, tracks, big ones. My breath fogged in the cool air as I crouched down, examining the prints. They were deep, the toes splayed out, but too large for any bear I'd ever seen. Whatever made them was heavy, hundreds of pounds, maybe more. And judging by the spacing, it had been moving on 2 legs. A rustling came from the trees to my left, and I swung the flashlight around. My hand shook as I pointed it into the dark, waiting for another glimpse of movement. The forest went silent, no crickets, no owls, not even the sigh of the wind, just a thick, suffocating quiet that settled over everything, making the night feel unnatural, wrong. I backed up slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel as I edged toward the truck. The radio on my hip crackled suddenly, making me jump. But instead of the dispatcher's voice, all I heard was static, deep, distorted, almost like a growl buried beneath the noise. I fumbled with the device, trying to adjust the frequency, but the static only grew louder, more distorted, like something was interfering with the signal. I turned, my flashlight beam darting through the trees, catching glimpses of movement, shadows twisting between the trunks. It was like it was circling me, keeping just out of sight. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but fear clawed its way up my throat, making every breath feel like a struggle. Suddenly, the static on the radio cut out, replaced by a voice that made my blood run cold. It was my own voice, crackling and distorted, repeating words I had said earlier in the night. "Hello? Possible injured animal, northern boundary. Can you check it out?" The voice echoed through the woods, warped and wrong, like something was playing it back to me. My hand tightened on the flashlight, my knuckles white. I spun around, shining the beam frantically through the trees, looking for any sign of the thing that was toying with me. And then I saw it, standing just beyond the reach of the light, half hidden in the darkness. It was tall, much taller than I'd thought, hunched over with long limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its eyes caught the light, reflecting back at me like an animal's. But there was an intelligence there, something cold and calculating. For a moment neither of us moved. It was like the forest held its breath, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I forced myself to take a step back, then another, my eyes never leaving the thing in the trees. But as soon as I moved, it straightened up, its body unfolding like a shadow coming to life. That was all it took. I turned and ran, sprinting back toward the truck, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. I could hear it behind me, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, growing closer with every second. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare look back. I stumbled, nearly falling, but somehow managed to keep my balance. I reached the truck, yanking the door open and diving inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. For a moment, everything was silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing and the distant hum of the truck's engine. But then, slowly, the radio crackled back to life, the distorted version of my voice echoing through the cab. "Hello, possible injured animal." The thing was standing just outside the driver's side window, its eyes level with mine, separated by a few inches of glass. Its face was wrong, too human, too animal, stretched into a grotesque mimicry of something familiar. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, pinned by that unblinking gaze. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows, leaving nothing but the faint impression of its breath on the glass. I jammed the truck into gear, the tires spinning on the gravel as I tore down the forest road, the trees blurring past. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see those eyes staring back at me, but all I saw was darkness, the forest swallowing up the trail behind me. When I reached the ranger station, I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. The dispatcher looked up from her desk, startled by the sight of me, pale, sweating, covered in scratches and dirt. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words tumbled out in a jumble, too fast and frantic to make sense. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I'd managed to snap a picture of the tracks, but my hands were too shaky to find the gallery. When I finally managed to look, the photos were nothing but black screens, corrupted files that showed only the shadowy outlines of trees. There was no evidence, no proof of what I'd seen, just my own shattered nerves and the knowledge that whatever had been out there, it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that knew how to stalk, how to hunt, how to play with its prey. I've kept my distance from the northern boundary ever since, but sometimes, late at night when I'm on duty, I hear the radio crackle with interference. A low, rumbling static that sounds almost like a growl, and in those moments I remember those eyes, watching me from the darkness, waiting. I don't think it's gone. Not really. It's still out there, somewhere between the trees, watching, listening, and maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for me to make the mistake of venturing too far again. Story 4. I never believed in monsters. Not until that night in Sasquatch Valley when the line between myth and reality blurred into a terrifying new world. My name's Mike Thornton, and I've always been a skeptic. So when my wife Lisa suggested we camp in an area known for Bigfoot sightings, I laughed it off as a fun adventure. We'd been married for 5 years, and I knew her fascination with cryptids was harmless, or so I thought. It was late September when we arrived at the remote campsite in the Pacific Northwest. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. As we set up our tent, I couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. The nearest town was over 30 miles away, and we hadn't seen another soul since turning off the main highway. "This is perfect," Lisa said, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she surveyed the dense forest surrounding us. "Can you imagine if we actually saw something?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Hon, the only thing we're going to see out here are squirrels, and maybe a deer if we're lucky." As the sun began to set, we built a fire and roasted marshmallows. The flames cast dancing shadows on the trees, and for a moment I could almost understand the allure of believing in forest monsters. Almost. We turned in early, exhausted from the drive and setup. The inside of our tent was cozy, and Lisa snuggled close to me in her sleeping bag. "Thanks for doing this," she whispered. "I know you think it's silly." I kissed her forehead. "It's not silly if it makes you happy." We fell asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But sometime in the dead of night, I jolted awake, my heart pounding. Something was outside our tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer or even a bear, curious about our campsite. But as I lay there, barely breathing, I realized the footsteps I was hearing were bipedal, heavy, deliberate steps that no human could make. Lisa stirred beside me. "Mike," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, then remembered she couldn't see me in the darkness. "Yeah," I breathed. "Just don't move." The footsteps circled our tent slowly. Whatever it was big. I could hear its breathing now, deep, raspy breaths that sent chills down my spine. Lisa gripped my arm tightly. I could feel her trembling. "What do we do?" she whispered. I had no answer. My mind raced through our options. We had no weapons, no way to defend ourselves if this was a predator. And some primal part of my brain was screaming that this was no ordinary animal. Suddenly, a heavy weight pressed against the side of our tent. The fabric bulged inward, and I could make out the vague shape of a massive hand or paw. The smell hit us then, a pungent, musky odor that made my eyes water. Lisa whimpered, burying her face in my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, my own heart threatening to burst from my chest. We lay there, frozen in terror, as the creature continued to investigate our tent. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the pressure on the tent released. The footsteps moved away, growing fainter until they were lost in the ambient sounds of the forest. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. We lay there, clutching each other, straining our ears for any sign of the creature's return. As the first light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric, we finally dared to move. "Should we look outside?" Lisa asked, her voice hoarse. I nodded, steeling myself. "Stay behind me." Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying that same musky scent, albeit fainter now. I poked my head out, scanning the campsite. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Our fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was alive with birdsong. But then I saw them, the footprints. "Oh my God," Lisa breathed, peering over my shoulder. The tracks circled our tent, just as we'd heard during the night. But these were no human footprints. Each impression was easily 18 inches long and half as wide, with 5 distinct toes. They sank deep into the soft earth, suggesting immense weight. I stumbled out of the tent, my legs shaky. Lisa followed, her face a mix of fear and awe. "Mike," she said, pointing to a nearby pine tree. "Look." My gaze followed her outstretched arm, and my breath caught in my throat. About 8 feet up the trunk were deep gouges, claw marks or scratch marks, I couldn't be sure, but they were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. "We need to get out of here," I said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded despite the panic rising in my chest. Lisa nodded, and we began hastily packing up our campsite. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The forest that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now felt oppressive, as if hostile eyes were watching our every move. As I was collapsing the tent, Lisa called out from near our fire pit, "Mike, Come look at this." I jogged over, my heart sinking as I saw what she'd found. Our cooler, which we'd secured in the car last night, was on the ground near the dead fire. Its plastic lid was cracked and warped, and deep tooth marks punctured the sides. "It got into the car," Lisa whispered, her eyes wide. "How did it open the door?" I shook my head, unable to process what I was seeing. I don't know. Let's just finish packing and get out of here." We worked quickly, throwing our gear haphazardly into the car. As I did a final sweep of the campsite, something caught my eye near the tree line. I walked over, my curiosity overriding my fear for a moment. There, caught on a low-hanging branch, was a tuft of hair. It was coarse and dark, almost black, but with a reddish tint in the morning light. Too long to be bear fur, and the wrong texture for any animal I knew. I hesitated, then carefully plucked it from the branch and placed it in a small plastic bag from our supplies. Lisa watched me with a mixture of fascination and fear. "Are you really going to keep that?" she asked, as I got into the driver's seat. I nodded, starting the engine. "Evidence," I said simply, in case anyone believes us." The drive back to civilization was tense. We both kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a monstrous figure emerge from the woods behind us. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that we began to relax. "What do you think it was?" Lisa finally asked, breaking the silence. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it wasn't anything I've ever seen or heard of before." She nodded, looking out at the passing landscape. Could it have been a Sasquatch?" A day ago, I would have laughed at the suggestion. But now, with the memory of those footprints and that musky odor still fresh in my mind, I couldn't dismiss it outright. "Maybe," I said softly. "Or maybe there are things out there we just don't understand yet." We drove in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Lisa spoke again. "Are we going to tell anyone?" I considered the question carefully. Who would believe us? We'd likely be laughed off as attention-seeking hoaxers or delusional campers. And yet, the thought of keeping this experience to ourselves felt wrong somehow. "We'll tell the truth," I decided. "To anyone who asks, we'll describe exactly what we saw and heard. What they choose to believe is up to them." Lisa reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you were there with me," she said. "I don't think I could have handled that alone." I brought her hand to my lips, kissing it gently. "Me neither," I admitted. As we drove back towards our normal lives, I knew things would never be quite the same. The world felt bigger now, more mysterious, and somewhere in those dark woods, something was out there, something that defied explanation. I glanced at the small bag of hair sitting on the dashboard. Maybe it would provide answers, or maybe it would just lead to more questions. But one thing was certain: our adventure in Sasquatch Valley had changed us both forever. The forests would never again be just trees and animals to me. Now, I knew they held secrets, and some of those secrets had footprints bigger than any man's. Story 5. It's amazing how quickly a camping trip can go from peaceful to terrifying. 1 minute, you're under the stars, the crackling fire keeping the chill away, and the next, you're wide awake, clutching a flashlight, trying to convince yourself that it's all just the wind. That's what happened to us that night. What started as a simple girl's trip to escape the stress of everyday life turned into something that still keeps me awake. And when the sun came up, I realized some things are better left unexplained. Sarah and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We wanted a break, no phones, no noise, just us and the wilderness. We picked a remote spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual tourist trails. It took us nearly an hour off the main road to reach it, our old SUV groaning over the rutted dirt path. But when we finally arrived, it was perfect. a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a babbling creek just a short walk away. The kind of place where the only sounds are the breeze through the trees and the occasional rustle of animals in the brush. We set up camp as the sun sank below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Sarah lit the fire while I finished pitching the tent, and soon we were sitting on logs, warming our hands and cooking marshmallows. It was quiet, peaceful, the sort of quiet that city life never offers. We talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and laughs, the flames dancing between us. It must have been around midnight when the fire burned low, and we decided it was time to call it a night. We crawled into our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire still lingering on our faces, and drifted off to the sounds of the forest. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had died down to embers, and the night had turned colder. I lay there for a minute, listening to the rhythmic breathing of Sarah next to me, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside the tent. I sat up, straining my ears, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a curious deer. But the scratching continued, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to move around the tent like something or someone was circling us. I reached over and nudged Sarah, whispering her name. She groggily asked what was wrong, but before I could answer, the sound grew louder, more insistent, like claws dragging against the fabric of the tent. We both froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances in the dim light of my phone. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on, the beam casting long shadows on the walls of the tent. The scratching stopped, leaving only the sound of our own breathing, ragged and uneven. I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing through all the possibilities. Maybe it was just the wind, or a branch rubbing against the tent, but deep down, I knew it didn't sound like that. It had been too precise, too deliberate. "Maybe it's an animal," Sarah whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Should we check?" I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed to stay inside, to wait it out until morning, but curiosity and a stubborn need to know pushed me to move. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows and the faint outlines of our campsite. I held my breath, listening. For a moment, all was silent, and then I heard it again, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from behind the tent. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, catching a glimpse of something slipping between the trees. It was too fast, too low to the ground to make out clearly, but it was definitely there, something dark and hunched. I yanked the tent flap shut, my hands trembling, and looked at Sarah. "There's something out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Her eyes widened, and she clutched her sleeping bag closer, fear written all over her face. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching the flashlight, listening to the occasional snap of twigs and the rustle of leaves outside. The air inside the tent grew stale and suffocating, every tiny sound amplified in the stillness. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that we were overreacting. But then we heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the dirt, heavy, slow, circling the tent once more. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. Sarah squeezed my arm, her grip almost painful, her eyes wide and unblinking. I pressed my ear to the fabric of the tent, trying to hear better, and felt my skin crawl when the footsteps stopped directly behind me. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then came a new sound, something low and guttural, like a growl. It vibrated through the fabric, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, nothing that should be out here in these woods. I turned off the flashlight, plunging us into darkness, and gestured for Sarah to stay quiet. My mind raced with plans. Maybe we could make a run for the SUV, but that meant opening the tent, exposing ourselves to whatever was out there. Or maybe it would go away if we just stayed still. But a deep, primal part of me knew that whatever was outside, it wasn't going to leave on its own. The scratching started again, this time more insistent, dragging along the side of the tent. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound, tasting blood. Sarah's breathing was quick and shallow beside me, her knuckles white as she clutched the fabric of her sleeping bag. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance, until all we could hear was the soft rustle of the trees. We waited, frozen, hardly daring to believe it might be over. Minutes passed, 10, maybe 20, before we finally dared to breathe again. I fumbled for the flashlight, shining it around the inside of the tent. My hands still shook, but relief began to seep in. "Maybe it's gone," I whispered, trying to convince myself. We stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep, flinching at every rustle, every creak. It wasn't until the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn that we dared to step outside. The forest looked different in the grey light, less menacing, more like the place we'd thought we knew. But as I stepped out of the tent, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the soft dirt surrounding our campsite, were deep scratches, marks that ran along the side of the tent, jagged and uneven, as if something with claws had dragged them through the earth. I knelt down, tracing the lines with my fingers, feeling the fear settle back in. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She came over, her face draining of color as she took in the sight. But that wasn't all. Around the tent, circling it like a hunter stalking prey, were footprints, huge, too big for any human, with long, narrow impressions that seemed almost bipedal. And then there were the claw marks on the trees, deep gouges that ran up the trunks, too high for any animal I could think of. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but every logical thought fell short. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice breaking, and for once I didn't argue. We threw our gear into the SUV without bothering to pack it properly, our hands fumbling with the tent poles. Every sound, every shadow made us flinch. We kept glancing back at the tree line, half expecting to see that dark shape emerge again, watching us with those eyes that I swore I'd seen glowing in the darkness. As we sped down the dirt road, away from the campsite and back toward the safety of town, I tried to convince myself it was all just our imagination, that we'd let our fear get the better of us. But the scratches on the tent, the footprints, the claw marks on the trees, they were all too real. We never reported it. Who would believe us? But sometimes, late at night when I close my eyes, I hear that scratching again, feel that cold presence just beyond the reach of the light. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't woken up that night, if we'd just kept sleeping while something circled us in the dark. Story 6. I've been a hunter for 30 years, but nothing in my life prepared me for what I encountered in the frozen wilderness of northern Minnesota. It was supposed to be a routine winter hunting trip. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. My name is Tom Erickson, and I've always prided myself on being a level-headed outdoorsman. I've tracked deer through blizzards, faced down angry bears, and navigated treacherous terrain. But what I experienced that frigid January day shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It started like any other hunting trip. I'd driven up to my cabin near the Boundary Waters, a remote area known for its pristine wilderness and abundant wildlife. The forecast called for heavy snow, but that didn't bother me. I'd hunted in worse conditions before. As I set out at dawn, the world was blanketed in white. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and my breath frosted in the air. The forest was silent, save for the occasional creak of a snow-laden branch. Perfect tracking conditions, I thought to myself. I'd been walking for about an hour when I first noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked like deer prints, but something was off. They were too large, too widely spaced, and there was something about the gait that didn't quite match any animal I was familiar with. Curiosity piqued, I decided to follow them. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from my usual hunting grounds. As I walked, the trees seemed to grow denser, the shadows deeper. An uneasy feeling settled in my gut, but I pushed it aside. I was an experienced hunter, after all. What did I have to fear? After another mile or so, I came to a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing lay the carcass of a bull moose, but this was no ordinary kill. The massive animal had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open like a grisly flower. Entrails were strewn across the snow, and great chunks of flesh had been ripped away. I'd seen plenty of predator kills in my day, but nothing like this. No wolf pack could have done this kind of damage, and bears were hibernating this time of year. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I approached the carcass for a closer look, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, rifle at the ready, but saw nothing but trees and snow. The growl came again, closer this time. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite wolf, not quite bear, but something altogether more primal and terrifying. My heart pounding, I backed away from the moose carcass. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of experience told me that would be a fatal mistake. Whatever made that sound was a predator, and running would only trigger its chase instinct. So I moved slowly, deliberately, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The growl came again, this time from behind me. I whirled around and caught a glimpse of something large moving through the underbrush. It was too fast, too fluid in its motion to be a bear. Panic began to set in as I realized I was being stalked. I picked up my pace, no longer caring about stealth. I just needed to get back to familiar territory, back to my truck. But as I moved, I realized with growing horror that I didn't recognize my surroundings. In my pursuit of those strange tracks, I'd ventured far off my planned route. The sound of heavy footfalls crunching through snow spurred me into a run. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. My lungs burned in the frigid air, and my legs felt leaden. But fear drove me onward. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that endless sea of white and grey. But eventually, I burst out of the tree line onto the shore of a frozen lake. I skidded to a stop at the edge of the ice, gasping for breath. For a moment, all was quiet. I turned in a slow circle, my rifle held ready. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and then I saw it. At the edge of the trees stood a creature that defied description. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to blend characteristics of wolf and bear, but it stood upright, on 2 legs, in a way that was disturbingly human-like. Its fur was a mottled grey and white, perfect camouflage for the winter landscape. But it was the eyes that struck me most, intelligent, predatory, and filled with a hunger that went beyond mere animal instinct. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. My finger trembled on the trigger of my rifle, but some deep instinct told me that bullets would be useless against this thing. It wasn't natural. It wasn't of this world. A low growl rumbled from the creature's chest, and I saw rows of razor-sharp teeth. It took a step forward, its massive paws leaving impressions in the snow that matched the tracks I'd been following. In that moment, I realized with crystal clarity that I was no longer the hunter. I was prey. Without conscious thought, I turned and ran out onto the frozen lake. The ice creaked and groaned beneath my feet, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls behind me, getting closer with each passing second. Halfway across the lake, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a howl, but not like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, filled with an almost human-like intelligence and malice. The sound echoed across the frozen landscape, and I felt it resonate in my very bones. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my lungs on fire, my legs numb from cold and exertion. The opposite shore seemed impossibly far away. But then, miraculously, I heard the creature's footsteps fade. A quick glance over my shoulder showed it had stopped at the edge of the ice. I didn't question my luck. I just kept running until I reached the far shore, scrambling up the snowy bank and into the shelter of the trees. Only then did I allow myself to collapse, gulping in great lungfuls of frigid air. As my breathing slowed and my heart rate returned to something approaching normal, I peered back across the lake. The creature was gone. The far shore stood empty and innocent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen. The image of that monstrous being was seared into my memory. It took me hours to find my way back to my truck. Every snapping twig, every shadow made me flinch. When I finally reached the familiar dirt road where I'd parked, I nearly wept with relief. I drove home in a daze, my mind still reeling from what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as some sort of stress-induced hallucination, but I knew deep down that it had been real, too real. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the internet for any information I could find. Wendigo legends, Bigfoot sightings, tales of skinwalkers. I devoured them all, searching for something that matched what I'd seen, but nothing quite fit. I never reported my experience to the authorities. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled a crackpot, my reputation as a serious hunter ruined. So I kept it to myself, but the encounter changed me profoundly. I still hunt, but never alone now, and never in that part of the forest. Sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear that unearthly growl again, and I wonder if somewhere out there in the vast wilderness that creature is still roaming, still hunting. One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forest the same way again. There are things out there, ancient and mysterious, that defy our understanding of the natural world. And sometimes, when we venture into the wild with our guns and our confidence, we forget a fundamental truth. We are not always the top of the food chain. Story 7. It's funny how a simple radio call can change everything. One minute, you're just a park ranger, driving the same dirt roads you've driven for years, listening to the hum of static on your radio. And the next, you're standing alone in the woods, feeling the air grow colder around you, with a creeping realization that maybe you're not as alone as you thought. That night, I learned the forest keeps secrets, secrets that you're better off leaving buried. The call came through just after sunset, the sky turning a deep purple as I drove along the winding trails of the park. "Hey, Roger, you mind checking out the north perimeter? Got a report of strange noises. Might be an injured animal or something," crackled the voice of my colleague, Claire, over the radio. I glanced at the map on the dash, tracing my finger along the northern edge of the park. The area was remote, miles away from the main trails, a place where few ventured. "Sure thing, Claire," I replied, my voice sounding confident even as a knot of unease twisted in my gut. The northern perimeter was a lonely stretch, dense with pines and undergrowth, and it had a way of making you feel like the trees were pressing in on all sides. But I'd been through it before, many times, and I wasn't about to let a few creepy vibes get to me. I steered the truck off the main road and onto a narrower, bumpier path, the tires crunching over gravel and twigs. The headlights carved through the darkness, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. The radio on the passenger seat buzzed softly with static, filling the cab with a low hum that made the silence outside feel even heavier. The air grew colder as I drove, my breath fogging the glass as the heater struggled to keep up. About 20 minutes in, I pulled to a stop by a small clearing and stepped out, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The cold bit into my cheeks, and I flipped up the collar of my jacket, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam swept across the trees, revealing nothing but tangled branches and the occasional glint of frost-covered leaves. Just another false alarm, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the uneasiness that clung to me. But as I took a few steps into the clearing, something caught my eye, a trail of bones, scattered like breadcrumbs in the undergrowth. I knelt down, examining them closer, my flashlight casting sharp shadows across the ground. They were clean, stripped of any flesh, and arranged in a haphazard line that led deeper into the forest. An injured animal wouldn't leave its bones behind like that. I straightened up, glancing around, half expecting to see a predator lurking nearby, but the woods were empty, silent except for the distant murmur of a creek winding through the darkness. I followed the trail, my boots crunching softly against the forest floor. As I moved deeper, I noticed more signs, tree trunks gouged with deep scratches, like something with claws had raked them. My pulse quickened as the flashlight beam caught on a tree where the scratches formed a pattern, almost like a mark or a symbol. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it looked deliberate, like a warning. The radio crackled to life on my belt, making me jump. I snatched it up, but the words were garbled, lost in the static. "Claire, do you copy?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No response, just more static, deeper, with an undertone that almost sounded like breathing. I turned back toward the truck, deciding I'd seen enough for one night, but then I spotted something that made my stomach turn. Half hidden in the shadows was a small wooden structure, an old cabin I'd never noticed before. The roof sagged, and the windows were dark, the glass cracked and smeared with dirt. It was the kind of place that felt wrong, like it had been abandoned for a reason. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, flashlight trained on the door, which hung slightly open, creaking softly in the breeze. Common sense told me to leave, to turn around and forget I'd ever seen it. But a nagging curiosity, that same stubbornness that got me into trouble more times than I could count, pushed me forward. The air grew colder as I approached the cabin, and a sickly sweet smell hit me, clinging to the back of my throat. I pushed the door open with the toe of my boot, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside, shining the flashlight around the interior. Dust motes danced in the beam, swirling through the stagnant air. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, and I caught glimpses of old furniture, an overturned chair, a table covered in deep scratches. Then the beam landed on something that froze me in place. In the center of the cabin, surrounded by piles of decaying leaves and more scattered bones, was a set of footprints, deep, fresh, pressed into the dirt floor. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own, with an odd shape, almost like a human foot but elongated, with long, clawed toes. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed toward the door, trying to keep the flashlight steady. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, pressing down on me with a suffocating weight. I fumbled for the radio again, lifting it to my mouth, but before I could speak, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a voice, low and distorted, crackling through the static. "Roger, behind you." I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but the doorway was empty, just darkness, thick and impenetrable beyond the threshold. The radio slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor, and I grabbed at it, fingers numb with cold. The voice crackled again, but this time it wasn't my colleague's. It was my own voice, distorted and warped, repeating words I'd spoken earlier in the night, mocking me from the shadows. Just another false alarm. Just another false alarm. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled out of the cabin, nearly tripping over the threshold. The forest outside was darker than I remembered, the trees closing in like a wall. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, something tall and hunched slipping between the trunks. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping against my face. My breath burned in my lungs, the cold air cutting through me like knives. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I caught sight of something that made my legs nearly buckle, a set of fresh tracks, following me, each step sinking deep into the earth, much deeper than my own. The cabin door creaked behind me, as if something heavy had pushed it open, and a low growl rumbled through the trees, vibrating through the air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I sprinted toward the truck, my only thought to get out, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was out there. I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. As I threw the truck into reverse, the headlights washed over the edge of the clearing, and I saw it, just for a split second, something tall and misshapen, standing at the cabin door, its eyes reflecting the light like cold embers. It watched me as I sped down the trail, its figure fading into the darkness as the trees swallowed up the clearing behind me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I drove without stopping until I reached the main road, my mind racing with what I had seen, what I couldn't explain. When I finally made it back to the station, Claire was there, her face pale as she listened to my jumbled story. I tried to show her the radio, to replay the strange voice I'd heard, but the playback was just static, nothing but empty air. She wanted to call it in, to file a report, but I convinced her to let it go, to chalk it up to a long night and a tired mind. Part of me thinks she was just as relieved as I was to forget about it. But I haven't gone back to the northern perimeter since, and sometimes, late at night, when I'm sitting in my truck on patrol, I catch glimpses in the darkness, shapes moving between the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I keep telling myself it's nothing, that it's just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night in the woods, whatever followed me from that cabin, it's still out there, waiting in the shadows, and deep down, I know that if I ever venture back to that clearing, it'll be waiting for me, ready to finish what it started. Story 8. I always thought the most dangerous thing in these woods was my own clumsiness. How wrong I was. My name is Emily Chen, and I'm an avid hiker with a penchant for solo treks. There's something about the solitude of nature that recharges my soul, or at least there used to be. Now, the thought of being alone in the wilderness sends chills down my spine. It was a crisp autumn day when I set out on what should have been a routine day hike in the Cascade Mountains. The trail was moderately difficult, winding through dense forest and offering stunning views of snow-capped peaks. I'd packed light, just water, some energy bars, and my trusty first aid kit. The forecast promised clear skies, perfect for a long day of hiking. The first few hours were blissful. The fall colors were at their peak, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I stopped occasionally to snap photos or jot down notes in my trail journal. It was shaping up to be a perfect day. But as the afternoon wore on, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. The forest seemed quieter than it should have been. The usual chatter of birds and small animals had faded to an eerie silence. I paused, taking a swig from my water bottle as I scanned the trees around me. That's when I first noticed the movement, just a flicker in my peripheral vision, gone almost before I could register it. I turned quickly, but saw nothing but trees and undergrowth. "Get a grip, Emily," I muttered to myself. "It's probably just a deer." But as I continued along the trail, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified in the unnatural quiet of the forest. I picked up my pace, suddenly eager to reach the end of the trail and the safety of my car. But as I rounded a bend, I stopped short. There, in the soft dirt of the path, was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. The shape was vaguely human-like, but the proportions were all wrong. Long, curved indentations at the end of each toe suggested massive claws, and the depth of the print spoke of immense weight. My heart began to race as I stared at the impossible track. This was no bear, no known predator. My mind flashed to cryptid legends, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, but I pushed those thoughts aside. There had to be a rational explanation. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard, deep and guttural, with an almost human-like quality that made my blood run cold. I spun around, searching for the source of the sound, but the dense forest revealed nothing. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, to move in ways that defied natural law. Fear gripped me then, primal and all-consuming. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of outdoor experience held me in check. Running blindly through the forest was a surefire way to get lost or injured. I needed to stay calm, to think rationally. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and began to walk quickly but deliberately back the way I'd come. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. I estimated I was still a good 2 hours from the trailhead, and the thought of being in these woods after dark filled me with dread. As I walked, the sense of being followed grew stronger. I could hear heavy footfalls behind me, branches snapping under significant weight. Whatever it wasn't even trying to be stealthy anymore. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short gasps. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of what was happening, but fear was quickly overwhelming logic. I found myself glancing back every few seconds, expecting to see some monstrous form looming over me, but the trail behind me remained empty, yet full of menace. The growl came again, closer this time. I could feel the vibration of it in my chest, and then, just for a moment, I saw it, a massive shape moving through the trees to my left. It was upright but not human, covered in dark fur, with limbs too long and a head too large to be anything I recognized. A strangled cry escaped my lips, and I broke into a run. All thoughts of caution vanished as blind panic took over. I sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I could hear it behind me now, crashing through the underbrush. The sound spurred me to greater speed, though my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. In my panic, I lost the trail. I found myself bushwhacking through dense forest, thorns tearing at my clothes and skin, but I didn't dare stop. The creature's heavy breathing seemed to be right behind me, its growls sending shockwaves of terror through my body. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire lookout tower, its metal frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Without hesitation, I sprinted for the tower. My hands shook as I fumbled with the padlock on the door, relief flooding through me when I found it unlocked. I yanked the door open and practically fell inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, all I could do was lean against the door, gasping for breath. The interior of the tower was dusty and clearly long abandoned, but right then it felt like the safest place in the world. But my relief was short-lived. A heavy thud against the outer wall of the tower made me jump. Then another. Something was circling the structure, testing its strength. I climbed the stairs to the observation deck, my legs trembling with each step. Through the windows, I could see the clearing below, and there, at the edge of the trees, stood the creature. In the fading daylight, I could finally see it clearly. It was like something out of a nightmare, 8 feet tall at least, with a massive barrel-shaped chest and arms that hung below its knees. Its face was a twisted blend of wolf and ape, with glowing eyes that fixed on me with terrifying intelligence. For what felt like hours, we stayed locked in this standoff. The creature circled the tower, occasionally beating its fists against the metal struts. The whole structure would shake with each impact. I huddled in the center of the observation deck, certain that at any moment the tower would come crashing down. As night fell, the creature's attacks became less frequent. By midnight, the forest had fallen silent once more, but I didn't dare leave my refuge. I spent the night huddled in a corner, jumping at every creak and groan of the old tower. When dawn finally broke, I peered out cautiously. The clearing was empty, showing no sign of the previous night's terror, save for some trampled undergrowth and a few bent saplings. I waited another hour before finally working up the courage to leave the tower. My descent from the lookout was painfully slow, every sense on high alert for any sign of danger. But the forest remained peaceful, filled once more with the normal sounds of birds and small animals. It took me most of the morning to find my way back to the main trail, and another few hours to reach my car. Every step of the way, I felt like eyes were watching me from the deep shadows of the forest. But I saw no further sign of the creature. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched local folklore, delved into cryptozoology forums, even reached out to wildlife experts, but I found no satisfactory explanation for what I'd encountered. I've been back to those mountains since then, but never alone, and never without a lingering fear that somewhere in those vast forests something is waiting, something that defies explanation, that blurs the line between legend and reality. My experience has taught me a valuable lesson. There are things in this world that we don't understand, forces of nature that we can't explain. And sometimes, when we venture into the wild, we're reminded that we're not always at the top of the food chain. The forests still call to me, but now I approach them with a newfound respect and caution, because I know that in the deepest shadows, in the quietest corners of the wilderness, there are mysteries that perhaps we're not meant to unravel. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't what you can see, it's what you can't. Story 9. I've always loved the solitude of the forest, but that day the silence felt oppressive. The shadows seemed to reach for me, and every snapping twig sent my heart racing. I should have known then that something was terribly wrong. My name is Sarah, and I've been a forest ranger for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all, from lost hikers to aggressive wildlife, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that fateful autumn afternoon. It started with a series of strange reports from hikers and campers in the area. They spoke of eerie noises in the night, unusually large tracks in the mud, and a persistent feeling of being watched. At first, I dismissed these accounts as the product of overactive imaginations. After all, the woods can play tricks on your mind, especially if you're not used to the isolation. But as the reports kept coming in, each more unsettling than the last, I knew I had to investigate. So, on a crisp October morning, I set out on the trail, my backpack loaded with supplies and my trusty rifle slung over my shoulder. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth usually brought me comfort, but today it felt different, almost oppressive. The first few hours of my patrol were uneventful. The forest was quieter than usual, with even the birds seeming to hold their breath. I tried to shake off the growing unease, telling myself it was just the power of suggestion. Yet, I couldn't help but feel like every tree concealed a watcher, every shadow a potential threat. As the day wore on, I began to notice subtle changes in the environment. Broken branches lay scattered across the path, too high up to have been snapped by deer or elk. The bark on several trees had been stripped away, revealing long, deep gouges that no bear claw could have made. My trained eye recognized these as signs of a large predator, but what kind of animal could leave marks like these? The sun was starting to dip below the tree line when I came across the first set of tracks. I've seen plenty of animal prints in my time, but these were something else entirely. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with distinct claw marks at the tips. The stride length between each print was impossibly wide, suggesting a creature of immense size. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched down to examine the tracks more closely. They were fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Whatever made them was still in the area. I stood up slowly, my hand instinctively moving to the butt of my rifle. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that sent primal fear coursing through my veins. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the dense foliage made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. Crack! The sound of a breaking branch echoed through the trees, much closer this time. I raised my rifle, my finger hovering near the trigger. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I strained my ears for any further noise. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, deliberately, something massive began to move through the underbrush behind me. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the creak of wood, as trees bent under an enormous weight. Whatever it was big, too big. I wanted to run, every fiber of my being screaming at me to flee, but years of training kept me rooted to the spot. Running from a predator is the surest way to trigger its chase instinct. So instead, I stood my ground, my rifle at the ready, and waited. The creature circled me, always staying just out of sight. I caught glimpses of dark fur through the trees, heard the soft thud of heavy footfalls on the forest floor. My mind raced, trying to identify what I was dealing with. A bear. No, the movement was all wrong. Mountain lion. Impossible, given the size. What I was experiencing defied everything I knew about the local wildlife. As the light faded, my situation became increasingly dire. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but in the growing darkness, every tree looked the same. The thought of spending the night out here, with that thing lurking in the shadows, filled me with dread. I had to move, to find my way back to the ranger station before it was too late. Keeping my rifle raised, I began to slowly back away, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Each step felt like an eternity, the crunching of leaves under my boots sounding as loud as gunshots in the stillness of the forest. That's when I saw them. Two gleaming eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight set high above the ground. They blinked once, slowly, deliberately. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes were intelligent, calculating. This was no mere animal driven by instinct. There was a consciousness behind that gaze, one that seemed to be evaluating me as much as I was trying to understand it. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I felt stripped bare under that gaze, all my years of experience and training, meaningless in the face of this unknown entity. Then, as quickly as they appeared, the eyes vanished, leaving me alone in the gathering darkness. I didn't wait to see if they would return. With shaking hands, I pulled out my flashlight and map, plotting the quickest route back to safety. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I walked as quickly as I dared, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a monstrous form lunging out of the darkness. The trek back to the ranger station was a nightmare of paranoia and adrenaline. More than once, I heard heavy footsteps pacing me through the woods, always just out of sight. The feeling of being watched was constant, oppressive. By the time I finally saw the lights of the station through the trees, I was nearly at my breaking point. I burst through the door, startling my colleague Mike, who was on night duty. He took one look at my pale, sweat-drenched face and knew something was wrong. "Sarah, what happened out there?" I opened my mouth to explain, but where could I even begin? How could I describe what I'd seen, what I'd felt? The rational part of my mind was already trying to explain it away. Stress, fatigue, an overactive imagination. But I knew, deep in my bones, that what I'd encountered out there was real. In the end, I simply shook my head. "We need to close that trail, Mike, at least until we can figure out what's going on out there." Mike looked confused, but something in my expression must have convinced him not to argue. He nodded slowly, reaching for the radio to call it in. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes in the forest. Whatever I'd encountered out there, I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. The woods had always been my home, my sanctuary. But now, for the first time in my life, I was afraid of what lurked in the shadows of the trees. I knew I'd have to go back out there to investigate further, to protect the people who came to enjoy the beauty of the forest. But as I looked out the window into the pitch-black night, I couldn't help but wonder, was I the one doing the watching now, or was something out there still watching me? The encounter in the woods changed me. I've always respected the power of nature, but now I understand its mysteries in a way I never did before. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. And sometimes, the line between predator and prey is thinner than we'd like to believe. As I sit here, writing my report on the incident, I can't help but glance out the window. The forest looms dark and imposing, its secrets hidden in the shadows. And somewhere out there, I know, a pair of intelligent eyes might be looking back, waiting for our next encounter. Story 10. I never should have gone camping alone. That's what everyone told me afterward. But hindsight is 20/20, right? If I had known what was waiting for me in those woods, I'd have run screaming in the other direction. But I didn't know. And now, I'll never forget. My name is Mike, and I've always been the outdoorsy type. Camping, hiking, fishing, you name it, I love it. So when my buddies bailed on our annual camping trip at the last minute, I decided to go solo. It was a decision I'd come to regret. The campsite was nestled deep in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by towering pines and rugged terrain. As I set up my tent that first afternoon, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Birds chirped overhead, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first sign that something was off came as the sun began to set. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of wildlife all day, suddenly went quiet. It wasn't a gradual thing either. One moment, the woods were buzzing with activity, and the next, silence. Complete and utter silence. I tried to shake off the unease that settled over me, chalking it up to my imagination. I'd been alone all day, after all. It was natural to feel a little jumpy as night fell. I busied myself with building a fire and cooking dinner, hoping the familiar routine would calm my nerves. As I sat by the flickering flames, eating my freeze-dried meal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, peering into the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, but there was never anything there, just shadows and trees. I turned in early that night, exhausted from the day's hike and unsettled by the eerie silence that persisted. As I zipped up my sleeping bag, I told myself that things would look better in the morning. How wrong I was. The howling started just after midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a distant wolf pack, but as it grew louder, I realized it was like no animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was too deep, too guttural to be a wolf or a coyote. And there was something else about it, something almost human. I lay there in my tent, every muscle tense, straining my ears to track the source of the sound. It seemed to be moving, circling the campsite. One moment it would sound far off, and the next it was so close I could have sworn whatever was making that noise was right outside my tent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the howling stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of my own breathing might attract whatever was out there. That's when I saw it, a massive silhouette passing by my tent. The creature, whatever it was walking on two legs, but it was huge, far larger than any man I'd ever seen. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as it moved with an unnatural grace, pausing every few steps as if to sniff the air. I don't know how long I lay there, barely daring to breathe, as the creature prowled around my campsite. It felt like hours. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, and I heard the thing retreat into the woods. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and peek outside, the campsite looked undisturbed. But there, in the soft earth near my tent, was a set of footprints that made my blood run cold. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, with clear impressions of claws at the tips. My hands shook as I packed up my gear, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous form emerge from the trees. I'd never broken camp so quickly in my life. As I shouldered my backpack and prepared to hike out, a flash of color caught my eye. There, snagged on a branch at the edge of the clearing, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. Before I could think better of it, I reached out and plucked it from the branch. It was like no animal fur I'd ever seen, too coarse for a bear, too long for a wolf. I stuffed the hair into my pocket and started the long hike back to civilization, my mind racing. What had I encountered last night? The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. A bear walking on its hind legs, maybe, or some kind of large cat I'd never heard of. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit what I'd seen and heard. The hike out was nerve-wracking. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow in the trees looked like a lurking monster. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that those eyes I'd sensed the night before were still watching me, tracking my every move. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried with relief. I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of the parking lot, my tires kicking up gravel. It wasn't until I was on the highway, surrounded by other cars and signs of civilization, that I finally began to relax. But the experience haunted me. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in those woods. I scoured the internet for information, reading accounts of other campers and hikers who'd had similar experiences. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but a few rang true in a way that sent chills down my spine. I became obsessed with finding an explanation. I sent the hair I'd found to a lab for analysis, but the results came back inconclusive. Unknown primate species, the report said. That only deepened the mystery. I thought about going back, about trying to gather more evidence, but every time I considered it, I remembered the terror of that night, the bone-deep certainty that I was in the presence of something that defied explanation, something that, perhaps, didn't want to be explained. Months have passed since that night in the woods, but I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman howl ringing in my ears. I've tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that the isolation and the darkness had made me see and hear things that weren't really there. But then I look at that tuft of hair still sitting in a plastic bag on my desk, and I know the truth. There are things out there in the wild places of the world that we can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble into their territory. I still love the outdoors, but I've never gone camping alone again, and whenever I'm in the woods now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere out there, hidden among the trees, a pair of eyes is following my every move. To those who say there's nothing left to discover in this world, that every mystery has been solved, I say this: spend a night alone in the deep woods, listen to the sounds of the forest. And if you hear something that doesn't quite fit, something that sends a shiver down your spine and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because out there, in the shadows between the trees, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that we're not always at the top of the food chain, and sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. As for me, I'll never forget that night in the woods, or the creature that visited my camp. And though part of me wants to unravel the mystery, to prove to myself and the world that what I saw was real, a larger part hopes I never encounter it again. Because some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. Some creatures are better left undiscovered. But still, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about those woods. And I wonder, is it out there still, prowling the forests? And if so, who will be its next uninvited guest? Story 11. I've always believed that a photograph captures more than just an image. It freezes a moment in time, preserving emotions, atmosphere, and sometimes things we can't explain. But on that day in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, my camera became a window to a world I never knew existed, and one I'm not sure I wanted to discover. My name is Emily, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've trekked through jungles, deserts, and Arctic tundras, always searching for that perfect shot, but nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in those misty woods. It was early autumn, and I had been commissioned by a nature magazine to capture the changing colors of the forest. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Beautiful scenery, perhaps some local wildlife if I was lucky. I packed my gear, said goodbye to my cat, and drove out to a remote area known for its pristine wilderness. The first few days were uneventful, albeit stunningly beautiful. The forest was a canvas of reds, oranges, and golds, with a crisp breeze carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I spent my time setting up shots, waiting patiently for the light to hit just right, or for an animal to wander into frame. It was on the fourth day that things began to change. I had ventured further into the forest than before, following a tip from a local about a hidden waterfall. The trees seemed to grow denser, the undergrowth thicker. The usual forest sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, chattering squirrels, seemed muffled, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I was setting up my tripod near a small clearing when I saw it. At first, it was just a blur of movement in my peripheral vision. I swung my camera around, thinking I'd caught a glimpse of a deer or perhaps a bear. But what I saw through my telephoto lens made my blood run cold. It was large, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its posture unmistakably humanoid, and its face, God, its face. It was a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an eerie intelligence. I froze, my finger hovering over the shutter button. Part of me screamed to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But the photographer in me, the part that had always pushed me to get the shot no matter what, kept me rooted to the spot. The creature hadn't seen me yet. It was moving slowly through the undergrowth, its massive form surprisingly graceful as it navigated the dense forest. I held my breath and pressed the shutter button, the camera's click sounding impossibly loud in the stillness of the woods. The creature's head snapped towards me, those unnatural eyes locking onto my position. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it vanished into the forest. I stood there, shaking, my camera still aimed at the spot where the creature had been. It took several minutes for me to gather my wits enough to check the photo I'd taken, but when I looked at the display, my heart sank. The image was blurry, showing only a dark, indistinct shape among the trees. It could have been anything, a shadow, a bear, a trick of the light. I packed up my gear with trembling hands and started to make my way back to my campsite. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that monstrous form looming behind me. When I finally reached my tent, I zipped myself inside, clutching my camera like a lifeline. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake all night, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate the creature was nearby. As dawn broke, I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There, on a tree at the edge of my campsite, were 3 long, deep gouges, claw marks from something far larger than any known predator in these woods. I approached the tree cautiously, my camera at the ready. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap, and caught in the splintered bark was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. With a trembling hand, I plucked it free and examined it closely. It was like no animal fur I'd ever seen. Too coarse for a bear, too long for a wolf or big cat. I slipped the hair into a plastic bag, my mind racing. What was this creature? Some undiscovered species, a mutant bear, or something else? The rational part of my brain tried to come up with logical explanations, but deep down, I knew I had encountered something that defied conventional understanding. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, scrutinizing every shadow. I took hundreds of photos, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature, but it never reappeared. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, watching me, waiting. As the sun began to set, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night in these woods, not with that thing out there. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder, my skin prickling with the sensation of unseen eyes upon me. The hike back to my car was the longest of my life. Every step felt like it was taking me further into danger rather than away from it. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful just days ago, now felt oppressive and alien. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and more than once I whirled around, certain I'd heard heavy footsteps behind me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of the parking area, gravel spraying from my tires. It wasn't until I was on the highway, surrounded by the comforting lights of other vehicles, that I began to relax. But the experience haunted me. In the weeks that followed, I pored over my photos, searching for any evidence of what I'd seen. The blurry shot from that first encounter was frustratingly inconclusive. But as I examined the other photos I'd taken that day, I began to notice things. Strange shadows at the edges of frames, odd distortions in the background, and in one image, just for a split second, what looked like a pair of glowing eyes peering out from behind a distant tree. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth. I researched cryptozoology, delved into local legends, and even reached out to experts in primate biology. The hair sample I'd collected was particularly intriguing. When I had it analyzed, the results came back inconclusive. Unknown primate species, the report said. Part of me wanted to go back, to try and gather more evidence, but every time I considered it, I remembered the terror of those nights in the forest, the bone-deep certainty that I was in the presence of something beyond my understanding, something that, perhaps, didn't want to be understood. Months have passed since my encounter in those woods, but I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, the image of that creature vivid in my mind. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a bear, or that the isolation and darkness had played tricks on my mind. But then I look at that tuft of hair, still sitting in its plastic bag on my desk, and I know the truth. There are things out there in the wild places of the world that we can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the reach of our knowledge. And sometimes, if we're not careful, or if we're too eager for that perfect shot, we stumble into their domain. I still work as a wildlife photographer, but I've never returned to those woods. And now, whenever I'm out in the wilderness, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not just the observer, but also the observed. That somewhere out there, hidden among the trees, a pair of inhuman eyes might be watching through a lens of their own, the lens of a predator, sizing up its prey. To those who say there's nothing left to discover in this world, I say this: there are shadows in the corners of our maps, creatures that defy classification, and sometimes, if we're very lucky or very unfortunate, we catch a glimpse of them. But be warned, once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The world will never look quite the same again. As for me, I'll never forget what I saw in those misty woods. And though part of me still yearns to uncover the truth, to capture that definitive image that would prove what I encountered, a larger part hopes I never see it again. Because some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. Some creatures are better left unphotographed. But still, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself looking through my old photos, searching for any clue I might have missed. And I wonder, is it out there still, roaming the forests? And if so, who will be the next unwitting photographer to capture its image? Story 12. I've always been drawn to the unknown, to the thrill of exploration. But after what happened in that cave, I'm not sure I'll ever look at darkness the same way again. My name is Jake Holloway, and my younger brother Ryan has been my adventure buddy since we were kids. We've climbed mountains, rafted rapids, and trekked through dense jungles together, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in the depths of Shadowmere Cave. It was supposed to be a simple spelunking trip. Shadowmere was a lesser-known cave system in the Appalachians, not too challenging but off the beaten path enough to satisfy our craving for adventure. We'd heard rumors of unexplored passages and unique rock formations, the perfect weekend getaway for two adrenaline junkies like us. We arrived at the cave entrance early on a crisp Saturday morning. The mouth of the cave yawned before us, a dark slash in the mountainside, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. It was clear that not many people ventured here. "You ready for this?" I asked Ryan, adjusting my headlamp. He grinned, his excitement palpable. "Born ready, bro. Let's do this." We double-checked our gear, ropes, harnesses, first aid kit, extra batteries, and enough food and water for a day's exploration. Then, with a final glance at the sunlit world behind us, we plunged into the darkness. The first hour was everything we'd hoped for. We navigated through narrow passages, marveled at glittering mineral formations, and even spotted a few cave-dwelling creatures. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of wet stone and the faint musty odor that seems unique to caves. As we ventured deeper, the passages began to widen. We found ourselves in a vast chamber, our headlamps barely penetrating the inky blackness that surrounded us. "Check this out," Ryan called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He was examining the wall near a narrow crevice. "These marks, they looked like claw marks." I moved closer, running my hand over the stone. Deep grooves were carved into the rock, each set about the width of my hand spread wide. They were old, edges smoothed by time, but unmistakable. "Probably just erosion," I said, but a hint of unease crept into my voice. "Water can do weird things to rock over time." Ryan nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "Yeah, maybe. But what if it's not? What if there's something down here we don't know about?" I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Like what? Cave monsters." As if in answer, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. We froze, listening intently. It came again, louder this time, a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. "What was that?" Ryan whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. I shook my head, struggling to maintain my composure. "Probably just air moving through the cave system. These places can make all sorts of weird noises." But even as I said it, I knew this was different. This sound had a quality to it that sent chills down my spine, almost like a growl, but deeper and more primal than any animal I'd ever heard. "Maybe we should head back," Ryan suggested, his voice tight with barely concealed fear. Part of me wanted to agree, to retreat to the safety of the sunlit world above, but curiosity and pride won out. "We came here to explore," I said firmly. "Let's at least check out that passage over there before we call it quits." Ryan hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. We made our way towards a narrow opening on the far side of the chamber. As we approached, I noticed more of those strange claw marks around the entrance, these ones looking fresher than the others. The passage beyond was tight, forcing us to move in single file. The air grew noticeably colder, and a faint breeze carried an odd, musky scent. Our headlamps cast long shadows on the rough walls, creating unsettling shapes that seemed to move in our peripheral vision. We'd gone about 100 yards when the passage opened up into another chamber. This one was smaller than the last, but what it contained made us both stop short. In the center of the room was a pile of something. At first, I thought it was just a mound of rocks, but as we drew closer, the beam of my headlamp revealed a horrifying truth. It was a pile of bones. Animal bones mostly, deer, maybe some bears, but mixed in were shapes that looked disturbingly human. "Jake," Ryan's voice was barely a whisper, "what the hell is this?" Before I could answer, that rumbling growl came again. Only this time, it wasn't some distant echo. It was coming from right behind us. We spun around, and in that moment, I saw something that defied explanation. Crouched at the entrance to the chamber was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even in its hunched position. Its body was covered in pale, almost translucent skin, with patches of coarse hair, but it was the face that seared itself into my memory. A twisted, elongated visage that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of bat and wolf, with milky white eyes that reflected our headlamps with an eerie glow. For a heartbeat, we all froze. The creature regarding us with those unseeing eyes, Ryan and I paralyzed with terror. Then it let out a roar that shook loose stones from the ceiling, and chaos erupted. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Ryan towards the passage we'd come through. We bolted, squeezing through the narrow opening with a desperation born of pure fear. I could hear the creature behind us, its massive bulk scraping against the stone as it pursued. We emerged into the larger chamber, gasping for breath. "The ropes!" Ryan panted. "We can climb out!" But as we raced towards our ascent point, a horrible realization dawned on me. In our haste to explore, we'd ventured into a part of the cave system we hadn't properly mapped. I had no idea how to get back to our entry point. The creature's roars echoed through the cavern, growing closer by the second. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I had to think, had to find a way out. "There!" I pointed to a narrow crevice high up on one wall. "That might lead to the surface. We've got to try it." We scrambled up the rocky slope, the sound of the creature's pursuit spurring us on. The crevice was tight, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. I went first, then turned to help Ryan. Just as he was about to enter the crevice, a massive clawed hand burst from the darkness, raking across his back. Ryan's scream of pain galvanized me into action. I grabbed his arms and hauled with all my strength, dragging him into the narrow passage. We climbed frantically, ignoring the scrapes and bruises as we forced our way upward. Below us, I could hear the creature's frustrated roars and the sound of stone cracking as it tried to widen the opening. Just when I thought my strength would give out, I felt a cool breeze on my face. With one final push, we emerged onto a steep, forested hillside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. We didn't stop to admire the view. Ignoring our exhaustion and Ryan's injuries, we half ran, half stumbled down the slope, putting as much distance between us and that cave as possible. It wasn't until we reached our car that we finally allowed ourselves to collapse, the full weight of what we'd experienced crashing down on us. In the days and weeks that followed, we struggled to make sense of what had happened. We told no one, knowing we'd be dismissed as crazy or attention-seeking liars, but we both knew what we'd seen was real. I've done research since then, delving into folklore and cryptozoology. There are stories in Appalachian legend of cave-dwelling creatures, monsters that lurk in the darkness beneath the mountains. Most dismiss these tales as campfire stories or local superstition, but I know better now. Ryan and I still go on adventures, but never again will we venture into unmapped caves. The scars on his back serve as a constant reminder of what waits in the depths. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about that creature. Is it still down there, prowling the lightless chambers of Shadowmere Cave? Are there others like it, hidden away in the vast network of caverns that honeycomb our world? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a cave entrance the same way again, because now I know that sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are all too real, and they're waiting in the darkness, just beyond the reach of our light. Story 13. I've been a hunter for over 3 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. But that day in the forest showed me how wrong I was. It taught me that sometimes the hunter can become the hunted in the blink of an eye. My name is John, and I've spent more time in the woods than most people spend in their own homes. I know the forest like the back of my hand. Every trail, every ridge, every animal sign. Or at least, I thought I did. It was late October, the heart of deer season. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. I'd set out before dawn, my trusted rifle slung over my shoulder, ready for another day of tracking. The forest was alive with the soft rustling of small animals and the occasional cry of a distant bird. As I made my way deeper into the woods, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The tracks were there, but they were different, deeper than usual, spaced further apart. I chalked it up to a particularly large buck, maybe one that had managed to elude hunters for several seasons. The morning wore on, and the strange feeling in my gut grew stronger. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No chattering squirrels, no woodpeckers hammering away at tree trunks. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I came across a small clearing and decided to take a break. As I sat on a fallen log, taking a swig from my canteen, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, not 20 yards away, was a deer carcass. But this was no ordinary kill. The animal had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open like a grotesque flower. This wasn't the work of a bear or a mountain lion. The precision of the cuts, the way the meat had been stripped from the bones, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. The kill was fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. As I examined the carcass, I noticed something else, a set of tracks leading away from the scene. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and they were bipedal. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No known animal in these woods could have left tracks like these. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my rifle raised, heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows deepening despite the midday sun. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. For a long moment, everything was still. Then I saw it, a flash of dark fur between 2 distant trees. It was massive, whatever it was, moving with a speed and grace that defied its size. I caught a glimpse of a face that was almost human, but not quite, eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. In that moment, I realized 2 things. I was no longer the hunter, and I was in way over my head. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd seen the creature. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of experience in the woods told me that running would only trigger a chase response. So I moved as calmly as I could, my finger resting lightly on the trigger of my rifle. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. It was like no sound I'd ever heard before, part animal, part something else. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about stealth. As I moved, I could hear it following me. Heavy footfalls, the cracking of branches under significant weight. It was paralleling my path, always just out of sight, playing with me, herding me. I broke into a run, all pretense of calm abandoned. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me now, gaining ground with each passing second. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my lungs burning, heart hammering in my chest. I burst out of the tree line onto a rocky outcrop overlooking a steep ravine. Dead end. I spun around, raising my rifle, ready to face whatever was pursuing me. Nothing emerged from the forest. The woods were silent once more, save for my own ragged breathing. Long minutes passed as I stood there, rifle aimed at the trees, waiting for an attack that never came. As the adrenaline began to subside, doubt crept in. Had I imagined it all? Was it possible that years of solitude in the woods had finally taken their toll on my mind? I lowered my rifle slowly, my arms shaking from the prolonged tension. That's when I saw them. A set of those massive humanoid footprints in a patch of soft earth at the edge of the outcrop. They led right up to where I was standing, then simply stopped. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Whatever had been chasing me, it had been right here, mere feet away from where I stood, and then it had simply vanished. I didn't wait around to see if it would return. I made my way back to my truck as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. When I finally reached my vehicle, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, gravel spraying from my tires. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, surrounded by signs of civilization, that I allowed myself to relax slightly. But the experience haunted me. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in those woods. I scoured the internet for information, reading accounts of other hunters and hikers who'd had similar encounters. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but a few rang true in a way that sent chills down my spine. I became obsessed with finding an explanation. I went back to the area several times, always in broad daylight, always armed. I never saw the creature again, but I found more evidence, more of those strange tracks, tufts of coarse hair caught on tree bark, trees with deep claw marks scored into their trunks. I tried to tell myself that there must be a logical explanation, a bear walking on its hind legs, perhaps, or some undiscovered species of primate. But deep down, I knew that what I'd encountered defied conventional explanation. My hunting buddies laughed when I told them about it, dismissing it as a tall tale or a practical joke. But they stopped laughing when I showed them the plaster casts I'd made of the footprints, when they saw the fear in my eyes as I recounted my experience. Months have passed since that day in the woods, but I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman growl ringing in my ears. I've tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that the isolation and the adrenaline had made me see and hear things that weren't really there. But then I look at the plaster casts sitting on my mantel, at the tuft of coarse, dark hair I'd collected from the tree bark, and I know the truth. There are things out there in the wild places of the world that we can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and I never go back to that particular stretch of forest. Yet whenever I'm in the woods now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere out there, hidden among the trees, a pair of intelligent eyes is following my every move. To those who say there's nothing left to discover in this world, that every mystery has been solved, I say this: spend a day alone in the deep woods. Listen to the sounds of the forest. And if you hear something that doesn't quite fit, something that sends a shiver down your spine and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because out there, in the shadows between the trees, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that we're not always at the top of the food chain, and sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. As for me, I'll never forget that day in the woods, or the creature that turned me from hunter to prey. And though part of me wants to unravel the mystery, to prove to myself and the world that what I saw was real, a larger part hopes I never encounter it again. Because some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. Some creatures are better left undiscovered, but still, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I find myself thinking about those woods, and I wonder, is it out there still, roaming the forests, and if so, who will be its next unsuspecting prey? Story 14. I've always believed that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the photo I captured that day in the backcountry of Olympic National Park left me speechless and changed my life forever. My name is Olivia Reeves, and I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade. I've trekked through jungles, scaled mountains, and braved Arctic tundras to get the perfect shot. But nothing in my career prepared me for what I encountered in those misty Pacific Northwest forests. It was late September, and I'd been camping in a remote area of the park for nearly a week. The fall colors were at their peak, painting the landscape in a riot of reds and golds. I'd come to photograph the Roosevelt elk during their rutting season, but so far the majestic animals had proved elusive. On my 5th day, I decided to venture deeper into the wilderness than I'd previously dared. I'd heard rumors of a hidden valley where elk were known to gather, far from the usual tourist trails. It was a risk. The area was unmapped and cell reception was non-existent, but the potential for unique shots was too tempting to resist. I set out at dawn, my backpack laden with camera gear and enough supplies for an overnight stay if necessary. The trail, if you could call it that, was little more than a game path winding through towering cedars and hemlocks. The forest was thick with mist, lending an ethereal quality to the landscape. As I hiked, the feeling of isolation grew. The usual sounds of the forest, bird song, rustling leaves, the occasional cry of a distant animal seemed muffled, as if the mist itself was dampening the noise. It was unsettling, but I pressed on, driven by the promise of that perfect shot. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing that seemed ideal for setting up a blind. A nearby stream provided a natural draw for wildlife, and the surrounding vegetation offered plenty of cover. I settled in, my camera at the ready, prepared for a long wait. Hours passed with no sign of elk or any other large animals. As the light began to fade, I was faced with a decision. Pack up and try to make it back before dark, or stay the night and hope for better luck at dawn. The thought of navigating that overgrown trail in the dark was daunting, so I opted to camp. I had just finished setting up my small tent when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd encountered in my years of wildlife photography. It was a low, guttural vocalization, not quite a growl, but deeper and more resonant than any animal call I knew. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Instinctively, I reached for my camera. Whatever had made that sound, I needed to document it. I crept to the edge of the clearing, every sense on high alert. The mist had thickened as night fell, reducing visibility to mere yards. That's when I saw it, a dark shape moving through the trees at the far end of the clearing. It was big, far larger than a black bear, and it moved with an odd, loping gait that seemed almost human. My heart raced as I raised my camera, fitting it with my longest lens. Through the viewfinder, I could make out more details. The creature was covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging below its knees. And its face, I sucked in a sharp breath. The face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that reflected the fading light with an eerie glow. I knew what I was looking at, even as my rational mind rebelled against the possibility. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the legendary creature of Pacific Northwest folklore, was standing less than 100 yards away. My finger hovered over the shutter release, trembling slightly. This was the shot of a lifetime, the kind of evidence that could revolutionize our understanding of the natural world. But as I prepared to take the photo, doubt crept in. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled a hoaxer, my career and credibility destroyed. In that moment of hesitation, the creature turned its head and looked directly at me. Our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of recognition, not of the creature itself, but of the intelligence behind those eyes. This was no mere animal. There was something ancient and knowing in its gaze. I took the shot. The flash illuminated the clearing for a split second, and in that burst of light I saw the creature in full detail. It was even more impressive and terrifying than I'd first thought, easily 8 feet tall, with massive shoulders and hands that looked capable of uprooting small trees. As soon as the flash faded, the creature let out a roar that shook me to my core. It was a sound of anger, of violation. I had intruded on its world, exposed it to the harsh light of human technology, and it was not pleased. Panic overtook me. I turned and ran, abandoning my tent and most of my gear. All I cared about was the camera clutched to my chest, containing the most important photograph of my life. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit. Its footfalls were heavy, shaking the ground and far too close for comfort. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I finally dared to look back, I saw only empty forest. The creature, it seemed, had given up the chase, or perhaps it had simply decided I wasn't worth the effort. Exhausted and disoriented, I huddled at the base of a massive cedar, clutching my camera like a lifeline. I spent the night there, jumping at every sound, certain that at any moment the creature would emerge from the darkness to finish what it had started. When dawn finally broke, I began the long trek back to civilization. It took me most of the day to find my way out of the backcountry, and by the time I reached my car, I was scraped, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but I had the photo. With shaking hands, I downloaded the images to my laptop. Most were blurry or obscured by mist and vegetation, but the one that mattered, was crystal clear. There, in the center of the frame, was undeniable proof of the impossible. I stared at the image for hours, alternating between elation and doubt. This photo could make my career, propel me to the forefront of wildlife photography and biological discovery, but it could also destroy me. The world of cryptozoology was fraught with hoaxes and ridicule. Even with this evidence, would anyone believe me? In the end, I decided to keep the photo to myself, at least for the time being. I needed time to process what I'd seen, to come to terms with how it had changed my understanding of the world. I did, however, return to that remote valley several times over the next few months. I never saw the creature again, but I found evidence of its presence, strange footprints, tufts of coarse hair caught on tree bark, and once a half-eaten elk carcass that had been handled with strength no known predator possesses. Each time I ventured into those misty forests, I felt eyes watching me. Not with malice, but with a wary curiosity. I was an intruder in an ancient realm, tolerated but not welcomed. It's been a year since that fateful encounter, and I still haven't shared the photo with the world. Perhaps I never will. Some mysteries, I've come to believe, are meant to remain unsolved. Some wonders are meant to stay hidden, protected from the harsh light of human scrutiny. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, lurking in the shadows of our world. And that knowledge has changed me profoundly. Now, when I look through my camera lens at the supposed wildest parts of our planet, I can't help but wonder, what else is out there, just beyond the frame? What other impossible creatures might be watching us, even as we convince ourselves we're alone in the wilderness? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at an empty forest the same way again, because now I know that sometimes the most incredible subjects are the ones that don't want to be photographed, and sometimes the most important shot is the one you choose not to share. Story 15. I used to love the night. The quiet, the stars, the way the world seemed to hold its breath in the darkness. But now the night terrifies me. because I know what's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. My name is Lisa, and I'm an avid hiker, or at least I was. Everything changed on that moonless night in the mountains. It was supposed to be a simple evening trek, a chance to test out my new headlamp and enjoy the solitude of the wilderness after dark. I never imagined it would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The trail was a familiar one, winding through dense pine forest before opening up to sweeping vistas of the valley below. I'd hiked it dozens of times in daylight, but this was my first attempt at night. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke. I set out just as the sun was setting, watching the sky transform from brilliant oranges and pinks to deep purples, and finally to inky black. As darkness fell, I switched on my headlamp, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom ahead of me. The forest took on a different character in the dark. Familiar landmarks transformed into looming shadows. For the first hour, everything was peaceful. The only sounds were my own footsteps on the rocky trail and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. I felt exhilarated, alive with the thrill of experiencing the wilderness in a new way. But then, something changed. It started subtly at first. A rustle in the underbrush that was just a little too loud to be a small animal. A shadow that seemed to move independently of the trees casting it. I tried to shake off the growing unease, telling myself it was just my imagination working overtime in the unfamiliar darkness. I picked up my pace slightly, suddenly eager to reach the viewpoint that marked the halfway point of my planned route. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that were definitely not my own, coming from somewhere behind me on the trail. My heart began to race. I told myself it must be another hiker, though I hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead. I called out a hesitant hello, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast darkness. No response, just those footsteps, steady and getting closer. I started to walk faster, my breathing coming in short. Sharp gasps. The footsteps behind me quickened to match my pace. Panic began to set in, my mind conjuring images of axe-wielding maniacs and hungry mountain lions. That's when I made the mistake of looking back. In the dim light cast by my headlamp, I saw two eyes reflecting back at me. They were set too high to be a normal person, gleaming with an unnatural, almost phosphorescent light. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of a massive, shadowy form behind those eyes before it melted back into the darkness. Terror gripped me. This was no person, no ordinary animal. This was something else entirely. I ran. I abandoned all pretense of calm, all thoughts of staying on the trail. I plunged into the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but still I ran, driven by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. The sound of its pursuit filled my ears, drowning out even the frantic pounding of my own heart. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that desperate flight through the dark woods. My headlamp bounced wildly, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope of shadows and half-glimpsed shapes. More than once, I thought I saw massive, clawed hands reaching for me from the darkness, but I didn't dare look back to confirm. Just when I thought my legs would give out, when I was certain those grasping claws would close around me at any second, I burst out of the tree line. I found myself in a small clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Surely, whatever was chasing me wouldn't follow me into the open. I was wrong. As I stood there, gasping for breath, I heard a low, rumbling growl from the edge of the clearing. Slowly, terrified of what I might see but unable to look away, I turned towards the sound. There, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood a creature out of a nightmare. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy, dark fur. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, powerfully muscled limbs ending in wickedly curved claws, a broad chest, and a head that was almost, but not quite, human. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. They glowed with an eerie, yellowish light, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly unnatural. As I stood there, frozen in terror, I had the unsettling feeling that this creature wasn't just looking at me, but into me, sizing me up not just as prey, but as something else. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a bizarre standoff. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some undiscovered species, a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion, or something else entirely, something that defied rational explanation? Then, just as I thought my heart might burst from the tension, a distant sound broke the spell. A car engine, somewhere far below us on the mountain road. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, its ears twitching. When it looked back at me, I saw something that chilled me even more than the sight of the beast itself, a flash of what looked almost like disappointment. With a speed that belied its size, the creature turned and melted back into the forest. The shadows seemed to reach out and envelop it, and in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I stood there for several long moments, unable to believe what had just happened. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had all been a vivid hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by the stress of hiking alone at night. But the racing of my heart, the scratches on my arms from my headlong flight through the forest, and the lingering sense of otherworldly dread told me otherwise. When I finally managed to move, I didn't head back to the trail. Instead, I made my way downhill towards the sound of distant traffic. I no longer cared about getting back to my car or following the proper route. I just needed to get back to civilization, back to the comforting lights and sounds of the human world. It was nearly dawn by the time I stumbled out onto the road, miles from where I'd parked. A concerned couple in an RV picked me up, alarmed by my wild appearance and babbling story about monsters in the woods. They probably thought I was on drugs or having some kind of breakdown. Sometimes I wished that had been the case. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched cryptozoology, delved into local legends, even reached out to wildlife experts. But nothing I found could fully explain what I'd encountered that night. I've never gone back to those woods, never hiked alone again. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, especially when darkness falls. Every shadow seems to hold the potential for danger, every rustle in the bushes a possible threat. But it's not just fear that lingers. There's something else, a nagging sense of incompleteness. As if in that moment of eye contact with the creature, some sort of connection was formed, some unfinished business left hanging. Sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself drawn to my window, staring out into the darkness, and I wonder, is it out there still, roaming the wild places of the world? And if so, what would happen if we met again? I used to think I knew the natural world, understood my place in it. But that night showed me how little we truly know, how thin the veil is between the world we think we understand and the mysteries that lurk just beyond our comprehension. To those who love the night, who find solace in the darkness of wild places, I say this: be careful, be aware, because sometimes, when you gaze into the darkness, something gazes back. And not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are better left hidden in the shadows, away from the light of day and the fragile certainty of our ordered world. As for me, I'll never forget those glowing eyes in the darkness, that sense of being sized up by something far beyond my understanding. It's a memory that both terrifies and fascinates me, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our knowledge. And sometimes, if we're not careful, or if we're too curious for our own good, we stumble upon them in the dark. Story 16. I've spent half my life guarding the coast, but nothing could have prepared me for the night when the lighthouse became a beacon for something far more terrifying than lost ships. My name is Mark Hawkins, and I've been the keeper of the Stormhaven Lighthouse for the past 15 years. It's a solitary life, but one I've always found peaceful. The rhythmic flash of the light, the crash of waves against the rocky shore, the cry of seagulls, these have been the soundtrack to my existence. But on that stormy night in late October, those familiar sounds were drowned out by something that still haunts my dreams. It started like any other day on the coast. The morning was grey and misty, with a stiff breeze coming in from the east. I went about my usual routine, checking the equipment, polishing the lens, and making minor repairs to the old stone tower that had stood sentinel over these treacherous waters for over a century. As the day wore on, the wind picked up. By mid-afternoon, I could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was brewing, and from the look of it, it was going to be a bad one. I battened down the hatches, made sure the emergency generator was fueled up, and settled in for a long night. The storm hit just after sunset, with a fury I hadn't seen in years. Rain lashed against the windows of the keeper's house, and wind howled around the tower like a banshee. I kept a close eye on the light, knowing how crucial it was on a night like this. The beam cut through the darkness, a lifeline for any ships caught in the tempest. It was nearing midnight when I first noticed something odd. Between flashes of lightning, I caught a glimpse of movement on the shore below. At first, I thought it might be debris washed up by the storm. But as I watched, I realized it was moving with purpose against the wind and waves. I grabbed my binoculars and peered out into the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, picking its way across the rocky beach, was a figure. But it was like no human I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a bulk that spoke of incredible strength. Even through the rain-streaked lenses, I could make out shaggy fur covering its body. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, maybe. But bears don't walk on 2 legs with that kind of gait, and they certainly don't have arms that hang below their knees. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of fascination and terror, the creature reached the base of the lighthouse. It began to climb, using the rough stone blocks as easy handholds. Its strength was incredible. It scaled the tower with a speed and agility that defied its bulk. Panic set in. I was alone, miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help. The storm had knocked out the phone lines, and my cell phone was useless this far from civilization. I was on my own. I rushed to lock the door to the gallery deck, but deep down I knew it wouldn't hold if that thing really wanted to get in. I could hear it now, over the howling wind, heavy breathing and the scrape of claws on stone. A thunderous boom shook the lighthouse, nearly knocking me off my feet. The creature was pounding on the door, each impact threatening to shatter the aged wood. I backed away, my mind racing. The keeper's house was connected to the base of the tower. If I could make it down the stairs and across to the house, maybe I could barricade myself in, wait out the night. Another boom, and the door splintered. A massive, hairy arm thrust through the opening, groping blindly. I caught a glimpse of curved claws, each as long as my finger. I turned and ran, taking the spiral stairs 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard the door give way completely, followed by a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. The sound was primal, filled with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. I burst into the keeper's house, slamming the door behind me and dragging a heavy bookcase across it. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might buy me some time. As if in response to my thoughts, something heavy slammed against the door. The bookcase shuddered but held. Another impact, and I saw the wood begin to splinter. I retreated to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find. It felt pitifully inadequate against the strength I'd witnessed, but it was better than nothing. The door gave way with a crash, and the creature squeezed its bulk through the opening. In the harsh glare of the kitchen lights, I got my first clear look at my pursuer. It was like something out of a nightmare, covered in thick, matted fur, with a face that seemed to be a twisted blend of ape and wolf. But its eyes were almost human, filled with an intelligence that was far more terrifying than mere animal hunger. For a moment, we stood frozen, regarding each other. I saw its nostrils flare, drinking in my scent. A low growl rumbled from its chest, and I saw saliva drip from jutting canines. I brandished the knife, trying to look more confident than I felt. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. To my shock, the creature paused. It cocked its head, as if considering my words. Then, to my utter disbelief, it spoke. The sound was guttural, more growl than speech, but the word was unmistakable. "Hungry." I nearly dropped the knife in shock. This was impossible. It couldn't be real. And yet, here it was, this impossibility made flesh, standing in my kitchen and telling me it was hungry. I can get you food," I stammered, edging towards the refrigerator. Just don't hurt me." The creature watched me, its eyes never leaving mine as I pulled open the fridge door. I grabbed the first thing I saw, a package of raw steaks I'd been saving for a special occasion. With trembling hands, I unwrapped the meat and held it out. The creature's nostrils flared again, and a long tongue snaked out to lick its chops. It moved with shocking speed for something so large. One moment it was across the room, the next it was right in front of me. I flinched, expecting to feel those claws tear into me, but instead it simply snatched the steak from my hands. I watched in horrified fascination as it devoured the meat in a few massive bites. When it finished, those intelligent eyes fixed on me again. "More," it growled. For the next hour, I fed the creature everything I could find in my kitchen. It ate with a voracious appetite, consuming a week's worth of groceries in one sitting. As it ate, I found my terror slowly being replaced by a bizarre sense of wonder. What was this thing? Where had it come from? And how had it learned to speak? When the food was gone, the creature seemed to relax. It settled its bulk onto the floor, regarding me with what I could almost swear was curiosity. Gathering my courage, I spoke. What are you?" It tilted its head again, considering. Then, in that same growling approximation of speech, it said, "Old, older than your kind, hungry, always hungry." A chill ran down my spine. "Are there more of you?" "Few, hidden, hungry." As dawn approached, the storm began to subside. The creature grew restless, glancing towards the lightening sky outside. "Must go," it growled. "Sun comes." It rose to its feet, ducking to avoid the low ceiling. As it turned to leave, it fixed me with one last penetrating stare. "Secret," it said. "Tell no one." And then it was gone, squeezing back through the ruined door and disappearing into the misty morning. I stood in my destroyed kitchen, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wondered if I'd gone mad, if the solitude had finally broken my sanity. But the claw marks on the door, the empty fridge, the lingering musky scent, these were undeniably real. In the year since that night, I've told no one about my encounter. Who would believe me? I've scoured history books and local legends, searching for any mention of creatures like the one I met. There are stories, of course, tales of hairy giants and forest monsters that go back centuries, but nothing that quite matches what I experienced. Sometimes, on stormy nights when the wind howls around the lighthouse, I find myself peering out into the darkness. Is it out there, watching? Will it return? One thing's for certain. I'll never look at the night the same way again, because now I know that in the shadows, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, there are things that defy explanation, things that are ancient and hungry and far more intelligent than we'd like to believe, and sometimes, on the darkest of nights, they come seeking shelter in the light. Story 17. I've spent my entire life in these hills, tending to my flock. I thought I knew every creature, every sound, every secret these mountains held. But that night I learned how wrong I was, and now I'll never look at my beloved hills the same way again. My name is Tom, and I'm a shepherd. It's a dying profession, I know, but it's in my blood. My father was a shepherd, and his father before him. We've roamed these Welsh hills for generations, knowing them as intimately as we know the faces of our own families. It was late autumn when it happened. The nights were drawing in earlier, a chill settling over the land that spoke of the coming winter. I'd been out since dawn, moving the flock to lower pastures where they'd be sheltered from the worst of the weather. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I started to guide the sheep towards the pen where they'd spend the night. That's when I noticed something was off. The flock was restless, huddling together more tightly than usual, their eyes darting nervously towards the shadows cast by the gnarled old oak trees that dotted the hillside. I whistled to my dog, Meg, and she circled the flock, keeping them together, but even she seemed on edge, her ears pricked forward, a low whine escaping her throat. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. After all, what could there be in these hills that we hadn't seen 100 times before? As darkness fell, I hurried the flock into their pen, counting them as they passed through the gate. 97, 98, 99. I frowned. There should be 100. I counted again, slower this time, but the result was the same. One sheep was missing. I sighed, resigning myself to a search in the gathering gloom. It wasn't unusual for a sheep to wander off, but I couldn't leave it out overnight, not with the foxes about and the occasional reports of big cats roaming the area. Grabbing my crook and whistling for Meg, I set off back up the hill. The moon was rising, casting a pale, silvery light over the landscape. It should have been beautiful, but somehow it only made the shadows seem deeper, more menacing. We'd been searching for about an hour when Meg suddenly froze, her hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in her chest, something I'd rarely heard from her before. She was staring intently at a copse of trees ahead of us, her whole body rigid with tension. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a howl, but like no animal I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It was wild, primal, and utterly alien to these hills. Meg whimpered and pressed against my legs, all her usual bravery deserting her. I couldn't blame her. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that sound as possible, but I couldn't leave without finding that missing sheep. Swallowing my fear, I moved forward, my crook held out in front of me like a talisman. As we approached the copse, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, on the trunk of an old oak tree, were claw marks. But these weren't the marks of any animal I knew. They were huge, easily as long as my forearm, and deep enough that sap was still oozing from the gouges. My hands were shaking as I ran my fingers over the marks. Whatever had made them was big, too big, and judging by the freshness of the sap, it had been here recently, very recently. That's when I saw the sheep, or what was left of it. The carcass lay at the base of the tree, torn apart with a savagery that turned my stomach. This was no fox attack, no work of a big cat. The poor creature had been ripped limb from limb, its wool scattered around like grisly confetti. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. What could have done this? What kind of monster was lurking in my hills? As if in answer to my unspoken question, another howl split the night air. Closer this time, much closer. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Fear gave my legs a strength I didn't know I possessed. Meg was right beside me, no longer needing any commands to head for home. Behind us, I could hear something crashing through the underbrush, something big, moving fast. I didn't dare look back. I focused on the path ahead, illuminated by the moon, praying I wouldn't trip on a root or stone. The sound of pursuit was getting closer. I could hear heavy breathing, the thud of powerful limbs hitting the ground. Just as I thought my lungs would burst, I saw the lights of my farmhouse ahead. I put on a final burst of speed, Meg and I hurtling through the gate and slamming it shut behind us. Only then did I turn to look back at the hill. There, at the edge of the light cast by the house, stood a creature out of nightmare. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its body was a twisted mix of human and animal features, powerfully muscled limbs ending in wicked claws, a broad chest, and a head that was almost, but not quite, human. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. They glowed in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly unnatural. As I stood there, frozen in fear, I had the unsettling feeling that this creature wasn't just looking at me, but into me, sizing me up not just as prey, but as something else. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a bizarre standoff. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature turned and loped back into the darkness of the hills. The shadows seemed to reach out and envelop it, and in moments it was gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my house. Meg pressed close against me, both of us jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I half convinced myself that it had all been some vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too many late nights listening to old tales in the village pub. But then I saw the muddy paw prints on my gate, far too large to belong to any normal animal, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that what I'd seen was real. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I discreetly asked around the village, trying to see if anyone else had seen or heard anything strange. Most brushed off my questions, but a few of the older folks exchanged knowing looks. They spoke in hushed tones of old legends, of creatures that roamed the hills in ancient times, neither fully man nor beast. I found myself poring over books of local folklore, searching for any mention of a creature that matched what I'd seen. I came across tales of werewolves, of shapeshifters, of ancient beings that lurked in the wild places of the world, but nothing quite fit what I'd encountered. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. I still tended my flock, still roamed the hills, but now I carried a rifle along with my crook. I never stayed out after dark if I could help it, and I always kept a watchful eye on the shadows. The creature never returned, at least not that I saw. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, I think I can hear that howl again, distant but unmistakable. And I wonder, is it still out there, roaming the wild places of these hills? And if so, what else might be lurking in the shadows, just beyond the edge of our understanding? I used to think I knew these hills, knew every secret they held. Now I realize how little I truly understood. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the reach of our knowledge, and sometimes, if we're not careful, or if we're too set in our ways to see what's right in front of us, we come face to face with them. To those who think they know the wild places of the world, who believe that every mystery has been solved, I say this: be humble. Be watchful, because sometimes when you gaze into the darkness of the ancient hills, something gazes back, and not all secrets are meant to be uncovered. Some are better left hidden in the shadows, away from the light of day and the fragile certainty of our ordered world. As for me, I'll never forget those glowing eyes in the darkness, that sense of being sized up by something far beyond my comprehension. It's a memory that both terrifies and fascinates me, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that roam the wild places we thought we knew, and sometimes, if we're not careful, or if we're too rooted in the land we love, we find ourselves face to face with the impossible, forced to question everything we thought we knew about the world around us. Story 18. I've been on hundreds of search and rescue missions, but none haunt me like the day we went looking for a hiker and found something that shouldn't exist. My name is Ethan Cooper, and I've been part of the Mountain Ridge Search and Rescue Team for over a decade. We operate in one of the most challenging terrains in the country, a vast wilderness of dense forests, steep ravines, and unforgiving weather. I thought I'd seen it all, but that day in late August proved me wrong in ways I'm still struggling to comprehend. It started with a routine call. A solo hiker, David Chen, had failed to return from a 3-day trek in the backcountry. His wife reported him missing when he didn't check in at the agreed time. Standard procedure. We've handled dozens of similar cases. Our team of 4 set out at dawn, myself, our team leader Sarah, and 2 other experienced members, Mike and Lisa. The weather was perfect for a search. Clear skies, mild temperature, and good visibility. We had David's planned route and were confident we'd find him quickly, probably just delayed by a sprained ankle or some other minor setback. The first day of searching yielded nothing unusual. We found some of David's boot prints matching the description his wife had given us, but they were at least 2 days old. We made camp that night at the last known point on his route, planning to fan out in a grid pattern the next morning. It was on the second day that things started to get strange. We split into 2 teams, Sarah and Mike heading north, while Lisa and I took the eastern quadrant. The forest was thick here, old-growth trees creating a canopy that dimmed the sunlight to a ghostly green glow. About 2 hours into our search, Lisa called out to me, "Ethan, come look at this." I made my way over to where she was crouched, examining something on the ground. As I got closer, I saw it was David's backpack. It was torn, not in the clean way that would suggest it had caught on a branch, but in jagged rips that spoke of violence. "What could have done this?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with concern. I shook my head, a feeling of unease settling in my stomach. Bear, maybe, but it's not like any bear damage I've seen before. We radioed Sarah and Mike, who quickly joined us. As we examined the area, we found more disturbing evidence. There were drag marks in the soft forest floor, leading away from where we'd found the backpack. And the tracks. I'll never forget those tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's boot. But it wasn't just their size that was unsettling. The shape was all wrong, elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe impression. And they were bipedal, walking on 2 legs in a stride that suggested something of immense size and weight. "What are we dealing with here?" Mike voiced the question we were all thinking. Sarah, ever the professional, tried to keep us focused. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Our priority is finding David. We follow the tracks." We moved forward cautiously, following the strange footprints and drag marks. The forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each step. The usual sounds of birds and small animals had faded away, leaving an eerie silence broken only by our own breathing and the crunch of leaves under our boots. After about a mile, we came to a small clearing. What we found there stopped us dead in our tracks. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure, like a nest made of broken branches and leaves, and scattered around it were bones, lots of bones. Lisa gasped, "Are those human?" I moved closer, my years of experience warring with the fear that was trying to cloud my judgment. "Some of them, yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But there are animal bones too, deer, bear, and some I can't identify." A low, rumbling growl echoed through the clearing. We all froze, our heads snapping towards the sound. There, at the edge of the trees, was a shape that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a body covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging below its knees, but it was the face that seared itself into my memory. A nightmarish blend of ape and wolf, with eyes that gleamed with a terrible intelligence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. I could feel the creature's gaze boring into me, assessing, calculating. This was no mindless beast. Whatever it was thinking, planning. Sarah was the first to break the spell. "Back away slowly," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "No sudden moves." We began to retreat, our eyes never leaving the creature. It watched us go, making no move to pursue. Just as I thought we might make it out of the clearing without incident, a heart-wrenching sound split the air, a human cry of pain and fear. "Help! Somebody help me!" It was David. The voice was coming from somewhere behind the creature, deeper in the forest. The monster's head swiveled towards the sound, then back to us. A low growl rumbled from its chest, and I saw muscles ripple under its shaggy coat as it tensed to move. "Run!" Sarah yelled, and we didn't need to be told twice. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear the creature in pursuit, its powerful strides eating up the distance between us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mad dash through the forest. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Finally, we burst out of the tree line onto a logging road. Our truck was parked about a quarter-mile down. Without a word, we sprinted for it. As we piled into the vehicle, I risked a glance back at the forest. There, just inside the tree line, stood the creature. It made no move to follow us onto the open road. Instead, it raised its head and let out a roar that shook the very air around us. It was a sound of frustration, of thwarted hunger, but also a warning. We drove back to base in shocked silence. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to reconcile what we'd seen with our understanding of the world. When we finally reported in, we were met with disbelief and skepticism. Our story was dismissed as a stress-induced hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by the pressure of the search. Without David or any concrete evidence, we had no way to prove what we'd encountered. A larger search party was organized, but they found no trace of the clearing, the bone-strewn nest, or the creature we'd seen. It was as if that section of forest had simply vanished. David Chen was eventually listed as missing, presumed dead. His family was told he likely fell victim to a tragic hiking accident or animal attack. But those of us who were there that day know the truth, even if we can't speak it aloud. In the years since, I've researched everything I could find on cryptid sightings and mysterious disappearances in our region. There are stories, passed down through generations, of a creature that stalks the deep woods. Native legends speak of a hungry spirit that devours lone travelers. Settlers told tales of a forest devil that could mimic human cries to lure in its prey. I don't know what we encountered that day. A survivor from some prehistoric age, an undiscovered species, or something beyond our current understanding of the natural world. What I do know is that it changed me forever. Now, when I look into the depths of the forest, I see more than just trees and shadows. I see the possibility of things that shouldn't exist, creatures that defy explanation. And I wonder how many of those who vanish in the wilderness fall victim not to accidents or exposure, but to something far more terrifying. One thing's for certain, I'll never venture into those woods alone again. Because now I know that sometimes, when you go looking for the lost, you find things that were never meant to be found. And sometimes the true horror isn't in what you discover, but in the knowledge that it's still out there, waiting in the shadows, watching and hungry. Story 19. I used to think camping was about connecting with nature, finding peace in the wilderness. Now I know better. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't want you there, and sometimes it's not just the wilderness you need to worry about. My name is Alice, and I used to love camping, Everything changed during that trip to Blackwood Forest. What was supposed to be a fun weekend with friends turned into a nightmare that still haunts me, even now. It was late summer when we decided to go. Me, my boyfriend Jake, and our friends Sarah and Mike. We'd all been stressed with work and thought a few days away from civilization would do us good. If only we'd known Blackwood Forest was beautiful. I'll give it that. Miles of dense pine trees, crystal clear streams, and more stars than you could count once night fell. We found a nice clearing about a 2-hour hike from the main campground, far enough away that we felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves. The first day was perfect. We set up camp, went for a swim in a nearby lake, and spent the evening around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. It should have been soothing, but there was something off about it. The calls seemed too close, too intense. More than once, I caught myself straining to make out words in the animal cries. We all brushed it off as imagination and too many ghost stories. If only we'd paid attention to that first warning. It was the second night when things started to go wrong. We were sitting around the campfire again when we heard it, a scream. Not an animal sound, but a human scream, filled with terror and pain. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "Maybe it's just some animal," Mike suggested, but his voice shook. We all knew that wasn't true. Jake stood up, grabbing the flashlight. "We should check it out. Someone might be hurt." Part of me wanted to tell him no, to suggest we pack up and leave right then. But I pushed the feeling aside. If someone was in trouble, we had to help. We set off into the dark forest, our flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. The trees seemed to press in around us, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Every shadow held the potential for danger. We walked for what felt like hours, calling out periodically, but heard nothing in response. No more screams, no calls for help, just the oppressive silence of the forest. "This is useless," Sarah said finally. "We should head back to camp." We all agreed, turning to retrace our steps. That's when we realized our mistake. In our haste to find the source of the scream, we'd lost track of our direction. The forest looked the same in every direction, a maze of identical trees. Panic started to set in as we realized we were lost. We tried to use the stars to navigate, but the dense canopy blocked most of the sky. Our flashlights, which had seemed so bright at the campsite, now seemed feeble against the pressing darkness. That's when we heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but as I listened, I could make out words, or at least what sounded like words in a language I'd never heard before. They seemed to come from all around us, a susurrus of alien syllables that made my skin crawl. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, their faces pale in the flashlight beams. We huddled closer together, our eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Then we saw the eyes. They appeared at the edge of our light, gleaming with an unnatural yellowish glow. There were dozens of them, surrounding us on all sides. They blinked slowly, deliberately, as if sizing us up. "Run!" Jake yelled, and we did. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. The whispers grew louder, turning into snarls and howls that seemed to come from just behind us. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight through the dark woods. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but still I ran, driven by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees into a small clearing. The others were right behind me. We stood there, gasping for breath, waiting for our pursuers to emerge from the forest, but nothing came. The woods were silent once more, save for our ragged breathing. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we realized we were back at our campsite. Somehow, in our panicked flight, we'd found our way back, but something was wrong. Our tents were shredded, torn apart as if by massive claws. Our supplies were scattered everywhere, and there, in the center of the devastation, was a symbol drawn in the dirt. It looked like nothing I'd ever seen before, all angles and curves that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Now!" No one argued. We grabbed what we could salvage and started the long hike back to the main campground. Every sound made us jump, every shadow seemed to move. More than once, I thought I saw massive, shadowy forms flitting between the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. The hike that had taken 2 hours on the way in seemed to stretch on forever. The forest felt alive around us, malevolent and watchful. The whispers returned, sometimes so quiet I thought I was imagining them, sometimes loud enough that I could almost understand the words. Almost, but not quite. And somehow, that was worse. Dawn was breaking by the time we reached the main campground. We piled into Jake's car and drove away as fast as we could, not stopping until we were miles away from Blackwood Forest. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We researched local legends, looked into the history of the forest. We found stories of Native American tribes that had considered the area cursed, of settlers who had vanished without a trace, of hikers in recent years who had reported strange experiences. But nothing fully explained what we'd encountered. Nothing could rationalize the whispers, the eyes, the feeling of being hunted by something beyond our understanding. We never went camping again after that night. How could we? The wilderness had shown us a side of itself that we were never meant to see, a glimpse into a world that exists alongside our own but remains hidden from view. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I think I can hear those voices again. I see those glowing eyes in the shadows of my room, and I wonder, what if we hadn't made it out of the forest that night? What if those things, whatever they were, had caught us? I used to think I understood the natural world, that there was nothing in the wilderness that couldn't be explained by science. Now, I know better. There are things out there, in the dark places of the world, that defy explanation. Things that lurk just beyond the edge of our perception, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble into their domain. To those who love camping, who find peace in the solitude of the forest, I say this: be careful, be aware, because sometimes, when you venture into the wilderness, you're not just an observer, you're prey. And not all predators are animals we can name or understand. As for me, I'll never forget that night in Blackwood Forest. The whispers, the eyes, the sense of being hunted by something far beyond my comprehension. It's a memory that both terrifies and fascinates me. A reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, entities that roam the wild places we think we know. And sometimes, if we're not careful, or if we're too eager to explore the unknown, we find ourselves face to face with the impossible, forced to confront the terrifying reality that we are not alone in this world, that there are ancient, unknowable things that walk alongside us, hidden in the shadows of the forests we once thought were ours to explore. The wilderness may call to you, promising adventure and escape, but remember, not all calls should be answered. Because sometimes, when you answer the call of the wild, something else answers back, and it's not always something you're prepared to face. Story 20. I've always believed that science could explain everything, that with enough research, enough data, we could unravel any mystery. But what I captured on camera that night in the forest, it shook my beliefs to the core. Some things, I've learned, are better left undiscovered. My name is Ryan, and I'm a wildlife researcher specializing in large predators. For years, I've studied wolves, bears, and mountain lions across North America. But it was an assignment in the Pacific Northwest that changed everything. It started with reports from local hikers and campers. They spoke of strange noises in the night, unusually large tracks in the mud, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Most scientists dismissed these accounts as the product of overactive imaginations or misidentified bear activity, but something about the consistency of the reports intrigued me. I decided to set up a series of trail cameras in the area. These motion-activated cameras are a staple in wildlife research, allowing us to capture images of animals without human presence disturbing their natural behavior. I spent a week hiking through the dense forest, carefully placing cameras in locations where the strange activity had been reported. The forest was beautiful, but there was something off about it. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed muted, as if the animals were holding their breath. More than once, I felt like I was being watched, the hair on the back of my neck standing up for no apparent reason. I brushed it off as the power of suggestion, my mind playing tricks on me after reading too many spooky encounter reports. After setting up the last camera, I hiked back to my campsite at the edge of the research area. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, but not the usual nocturnal chorus I was accustomed to. The howls and cries seemed almost deliberate, as if they were trying to communicate something. I found myself straining to make out words in the cacophony, shaking my head at my own foolishness. I spent a restless night in my tent, jumping at every snapping twig and rustle of leaves. When dawn finally broke, I was eager to begin checking the cameras, hoping for some concrete evidence to explain the strange atmosphere of the forest. The first few cameras yielded nothing out of the ordinary: deer, raccoons, the occasional bear. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, things began to change. The images started showing blurred movement, dark shapes just at the edge of the frame. Could be nothing, I told myself. Just animals moving too fast for the camera to capture clearly. It was the last camera that changed everything. As I plugged the memory card into my tablet, my hands were shaking slightly. The hike to this final camera had been unnerving. The silence in this part of the forest was absolute, not even the sound of birds or insects breaking the stillness. It felt as if the entire woods were holding its breath, waiting for something. I scrolled through the images, my excitement growing with each swipe of my finger. More blurred shapes, closer this time. A shadow that seemed too tall, too upright to be a bear, and then I nearly dropped the tablet. There, in crystal-clear high definition, was a creature that shouldn't exist. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, powerfully muscled limbs ending in wicked claws, a broad chest, and a head that was almost, but not quite, human. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. They seemed to glow with an inner light, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly unnatural, and they were looking directly at the camera. No, not at the camera, through it, as if the creature knew I would be seeing this image. I sat there, staring at the photo, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a man in a costume, something, anything other than what it appeared to be. With trembling fingers, I checked the timestamp on the image, 3:47 a.m. last night. While I had been lying awake in my tent, this thing had been out here, less than a mile away. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed to press in around me, shadows deepening despite the midday sun. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. For a long moment, everything was still. Then I saw it, a flash of dark fur between 2 distant trees. It was massive, moving with a speed and grace that defied its size. I caught a glimpse of a face that was almost human, but not quite. Eyes that gleamed with that same unnatural intelligence I'd seen in the photo. In that moment, I realized 2 things. I was no longer the observer, and I was in way over my head. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Fear gave my legs a strength I didn't know I possessed. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear something crashing through the forest, something big, moving fast. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight through the woods. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. But still I ran, driven by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees onto the logging road where I'd parked my truck. I fumbled with the keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest was silent now, no sign of pursuit, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows between the trees. As I sped away, my mind raced. What had I seen? What was that creature? My scientific training warred with the evidence of my own eyes. I wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, a product of stress and isolation. But I knew, deep in my gut, that what I'd seen was real. In the days that followed, I pored over the images from the trail cameras. Most were inconclusive, blurred shapes, shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees casting them. But that one clear image, it haunted me. I debated what to do with the evidence. Part of me wanted to share it with the world, to prove that there were still mysteries out there, creatures that defied our understanding of the natural world. But another part, a part that grew stronger with each passing day, wanted to destroy it all, to pretend I'd never seen what I'd seen. In the end, I compromised. I submitted a report to my superiors, detailing unusual but inconclusive activity in the research area. I suggested further study might be warranted, but made no mention of the clear image or my personal encounter. The memory card with that photo, I keep it locked away, unable to look at it again but unwilling to destroy it. I've never returned to those woods. My colleagues think I've developed a sudden aversion to fieldwork, preferring the safety of the lab and data analysis. They don't know that every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing, intelligent eyes staring back at me. That every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sends my heart racing. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I find myself pulling out that memory card. I never look at it, just turn it over in my hands, wondering, what if I had gotten a clearer image? What if I had stayed to observe the creature further? What if I had shared what I'd found with the world? But then I remember the terror of that moment in the woods, the feeling of being hunted by something beyond my understanding. And I know I made the right choice. To those who seek to uncover the mysteries of the natural world, who believe that science can explain everything, I say this: be careful what you wish for. There are things out there, in the dark places of the world, that defy explanation. Things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding, waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, if we're not careful, or if we're too eager for that groundbreaking discovery, we find ourselves face to face with something we were never meant to see, something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the world around us. As for me, I'll never forget what I saw in those woods, the creature, the chase, the feeling of being watched by something far beyond my comprehension. It's a memory that both terrifies and fascinates me, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy scientific explanation, entities that roam the wild places we think we know. The image on that memory card is proof that some mysteries are better left unsolved. That sometimes the most important discovery is knowing when to stop looking, because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The world will never look quite the same again, and somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest, something is watching, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, it's learning about us too,